I believe that I'm live. I'll just wait for the chat to catch up. Hello everyone. Seems that Sunday afternoon is a good time to stream because people, well, they have time on their hands. I hope everyone had a restful Sunday and an observant Remembrance Sunday. Went to my local mass. There we go. I definitely am live. Excellent. I thought we should have a chat because it's very rare that we convene a kind of round table publicly on the right. I've been in a bunch of closed room discussions about strategy and tactics with some notable faces, but very little of that curtain is lifted for people who are interested in politics but neither have the proximity to Westminster nor are clued in on these conversations. And I will say this particular stream will probably leave me out of some of those conversations going forward, but I think it's important to discuss some of the stuff that I have experienced over the last few years since becoming involved in politics and the media in Britain. Because the gatekeeping is chronic, because we are going to suffer from a serious shortage in the next few years of capable talent, critical thinkers, sharp minds on the British right. And I think this has crossover to what's happening in America at the moment because the likes of Nick Fuentes are a product of their circumstances. I think there's a lesson to be found no matter what one thinks of what Nick says, and I have made my case clear before that I disagree with him on things like Islam and even some foreign affairs. I think his abrasive approach towards people like Oran McIntyre or Captive Dreamer, insulting J.D. Vance, is unhelpful, unwarranted. He swings at as many, or if not more, friends than enemies. But nobody's going to be able to tell Nick Fuentes what to do. And that's the point. He was cancelled and deplatformed from everywhere conceivable, and it only made him stronger. And so, there is a lesson for those who attempt to contain or censor popular voices, up-and-comers on the British right, who say things that are uncomfortable to hear at North London and Westminster dinner parties. And there's a lot of that going on at the moment, and it's why I and a lot of my friends have taken to building our own institutions. There's a reason Restore Britain exists, for example. It's not just because Rupert Lowe was defenestrated from Reform UK unceremoniously by an unrepentant Zia Yusuf. It's because the likes of its employees, my good friends, Charlie Downs, Harrison Pitt, Lewis Brackpool, were out in the wilderness. They were talent on the table, but very few political actors had the good sense to take up, and it was only Rupert Lowe, really, who donates his salary to charity, who doesn't fear ostracism from a political class that he seeks no approval of, who thought, yeah, I'll take a chance on these guys. I'll invest in the talent of the future. But other parties, other media institutions, other investors do not have the same approach. Instead, they would like to contain, limit, gatekeep, and censor the conversation, and slow where it needs to go. So we'll get into all of that. Before we start, I thought I'd put a couple of things on your radar. Here is my latest interview with GB News. Could well be the last after today's conversation. But it's doing quite well. And they asked to have me back because last time I was on, it got nearly 400,000 views talking about Islam. And there's a lesson in there too. If you are just consistent, if you speak unfiltered, if you speak what you believe to be true and leave yourself open to correction, then organically people will start to listen. Even if it is topics that lots of people would rather the conversation stay within the confined boundaries of, again, what is polite at dinner parties. Even if that's the case, well, sometimes your presence can become undeniable. You can become too big of a problem to ignore. That is my ambition. That is what I think everyone's ambition should be who ends up listening to this stream. And I wouldn't wager that this is going to have the largest audience of all of my content. but I think it's important that those of us who are interested in political theory, in making substantive gains and changes, have these sorts of conversations so that we can have basically a strategy meeting. And I want all of you guys to become that problem. You know, Fuentes had a lot of success because his loyal army, Groypers, didn't just stay online. They went and got jobs in Washington, D.C. They went to Q&As. They asked uncomfortable questions. They were confrontational. Sometimes went beyond the boundaries of what is acceptable behavior, you know, doxing and being impolite excessively on social media. I think we should hold ourselves to a high standard, you know, be well informed, be erudite, be gentlemanly, but press. Make people who would not like to confront the difficult issues feel uncomfortable at their own events. Attend these events. Make sure you're on social media, making your voice heard in a way that doesn't discredit the movement. Everyone listening here should take that practice. And that's what I try to do. Anytime I'm offered a mainstream media platform where I can cut through the noise, I take it. There's also a new show that I've got with Tate Brown of Timcost. It's being hosted on the Culture War channel, doing some transatlantic cross-pollination on politics. So that's linked in the description. There'll be a clip out on my channel. You can go and check that out. So I wanted to start the stream with the following clip. Lots of you will have seen this. This was on Good Morning Britain. That is the most normie-friendly ITV morning show in Britain. And this was on the 7th of November. So 2 days ago. And this was a World War II veteran. And on air, yes, I do read the chat. Thank you very much. On air, this World War II veteran let slip that he thought that all the sacrifices that he and his dead friends made weren't worth it, because the state of the country now is not what he fought for. So I'm going to play this clip, and you might wonder why it's relevant, but it's because this is the prime example of a containment breach, and watch how hurriedly the presenters on the sofa tried to reroute the conversation back to what best fit their Blairite multicultural narrative. So that was a containment breach, but not for the reason most people that watched it thought it was. If you noticed, and obviously there's pre-screening involved in whichever guests they get on the show. I've been invited on the show multiple times, by the way, and when I've given my take on the debate topic that they've presented me with, they've gone, oh, okay, we're going to go with another guest, and it's always presenting the conservative or right-wing position, a minority or a left-behind liberal. Because those are the only acceptable frames of reference through which the establishment can launder, in a limited fashion, right-wing ideas. This is why, for example, the conservative representation you'll have on Question Time is, and this isn't me criticising him because he's been very good to me, Konstantin Kisin, for example. Someone who has the correct opinions on foreign policy regarding Ukraine, but who might have some more retrograde opinions on immigration, saying, you know, we should deport every illegal immigrant, we should significantly limit legal migration, and we should encourage integration. They will never have on someone like myself or Carl Benjamin, you know, someone who is a bit more firebrand, because we are seen as rogue elements, despite our sizable audiences. Carl much more so than mine, of course. And this is not meant to be a slight at Constantine. This is the way that establishment, opposition media, allows certain slivers of heterodox opinions to break through their narrative control. It's a bit like when sunlight shines through the curtains in The Secret Garden. You know, that kid who is convinced via Munchausen syndrome that he's sickly and allergic to sunlight and will die if he goes outside. They react in the same way to an unplanned fissure of truth breaking through. And this was an unplanned fissure of truth, but not in the way that we think. And the reason is, I say all this about screening guests, Because this veteran in question, it codes a different way to us. The fact that he thanked Kate Garraway for sending a message to the youth means he laments the rise of racist populism. He laments the rise of misinformation. He laments, as Michael Heseltine said of Reform UK, the far right in Britain, or Donald Trump. But the fact that he was non-specific, and the fact that the scene played out in the way it did, with Kate Garraway, who was married to one of the architects of Tony Blair's government before he died, and Adil Ray, a Pakistani identitarian, who tweeted just 2 days before this that he supports Zohran Mamdani winning in New York, and he said that Sharia law is founded on love and compassion. So he hopes Mamdani will bring in Sharia law, which prompted, apparently, backstage crisis meetings with ITV executives. The fact that they immediately rushed in to pat him on the shoulder and be patronising, and Adil Ray played hatchling and went, "Oh, what do you mean?" and no answer was given, meant that to those watching, what the scene meant was our boys in uniform didn't die for the likes of Sharia supporting Adil Ray to sit on a sofa opposite him and act as if nothing was wrong with the country. Because what is wrong with the country is Adil Ray and Kate Garraway. So it meant something very different to us, and this is why it was an inadvertent containment breach. That is why they tried to dispel some of that unintended optical catastrophe. So the reason I brought this up is because there are a bunch of different types of containment breaches. There is incidental containment. That's people following incentives either out of cowardice or risk aversion or because there's too much money on the line. And then that money power recognizes that risk aversion, that dependency of people on their incomes to pay their mortgages, on these implied opportunities dangled over their heads so that you don't annoy the wrong person or say the wrong thing in an interview or a podcast, that you don't challenge the wrong taboo or hold power to account. They then hold those opportunities and those lucrative rewards for staying on the ideological plantation over their head and create an incentive structure by positioning people that agree with them or that know what the game is in positions of influence in media, in politics, and the like. And then there's purposeful containment. Then there's just lying and gaslighting and narrative control. And in order to maintain that, you get people conducting limited hangouts. Limited hangouts is a term that means occasionally when people are trying to control the narratives, to manipulate you, to gaslight you, to keep a stranglehold on power, to have it so that certain things remain beyond the pale, they will occasionally have podcasts or articles or events go on and let slip some of what you know to be true to then siphon off the discontent and revolutionary energy that is building around a problem or an obvious contradiction that is not being addressed. And we can see a lot of this going on the British right. So, an example of inadvertent containment, risk-averse containment, would be this week. So, there was this event going on at Wandsworth Question Time. Wandsworth is a Reform UK local chapter. Now, I am not a member of Reform UK. I am a critical friend of Reform. I voted for Reform multiple times, including in 2021 when Richard Tice ran as an MP in an area where I used to live. And in the last election, despite their candidate being woeful in my area, because I wanted to send a protest vote message against the ruling Conservative Party, and I hoped that it would encourage them to be a bit more bold on their campaigning issues, if they saw the size of support that people would have. And that worked for a while, right? I mean, I spoke at Reform's conference in 2024 at a fringe event with Charlie Downs and Noel, I forget his surname, but he was a Reform candidate. And that was after Nigel Farage had told Stephen Edgington, we're not going to do mass deportations, it's not my ambition, it's a political impossibility. If I agree with it, then it's all that people are going to ask me about. So Farage was being risk-averse, having his willingness to be bold on certain issues dictated by whether or not he'd be called mean names by the media. So, inadvertently containing his own side because he thought his personal reputation was on the line, because he still held the likes of the BBC and ITV and Sky News in high esteem. So, pulling up the ladder up after himself, just because he was worried about the names he would be called by his enemies. And that is how containment is conducted on your enemy's behalf, even though you don't have to be a plant or a conscious containment agent on one's own side. Now, because there were so many breaches, for example, me being at Reform Conference and saying the number one policy they could do on stage was mass deportations, hence the leftist freakout, but mass applause by Reform's own supporters, eventually the demand for such a policy becomes so large among your own base that it becomes a liability for you to keep rejecting it, keep denouncing it. Adam Wren, for example, did some polling in the aftermath of Rupert Lowe being kicked out of Reform UK when Nigel Farage, or at least whoever wrote his piece for him in The Telegraph, had said that Rupert Lowe saying at his North West Essex rally that he wanted mass deportations was a dark and dangerous use of rhetoric. After that was out, Adam Wren did some polling among Reform UK. 99% of Reform members expected, not just wanted, not just supported, expected Reform to deport every single illegal immigrant in the country. When that is the prevailing opinion among your own support base, when you are gaining momentum because people perceive you to be that party, when you are the dominant party by a factor of 10 points in consistent polls across the country, when so many people are constantly asking you, why don't you support a policy that has one trump the election, one trump the popular vote, and is logistically possible, then it becomes impossible to denounce it. So I say all of this to say that Reform are risk-averse. Reform must be encouraged through carrot and stick. When they do something we don't like, we notify them. When they do something we do like, we reward them with public support, because they are clearly amenable to public feedback. Even though Nigel Farage said he's not a populist, he's an unpopulist, he does want to be liked. He does want to be approved of. And if the only basis for his public opinion is based on how Sky, the BBC, ITV treat him, then he will drift leftward over time out of risk aversion. You have to create a different power base to give him feedback, which means social media. So, all of this is to say, it was encouraging when I was invited by Reform members to participate in a panel debate at one of their local associations in Wandsworth. This came about because I ran into a guy, by chance, walking through Westminster. He was at the pub, he ran over, said hello, had seen my stuff, and said, would I be interested in participating in a locals event? Originally, David Bull, who is the chairman for Reform UK, was registered to be part of this event, but for reasons unknown, by the time I was asked to promote the ticket sales, to encourage people to come along and ask questions, he had pulled out. David Bull I've criticised before, by the way, because he was the guy who said, Britain is a nation of immigrants, an island of immigrants, we always have been. This country was built by immigrants, a completely fictitious narrative. He supported the suggestion that you could put trans-identifying men in women's prisons, and he previously had a go at me on Breakfast TV in January of 2024 for advocating the death penalty. I said rope is cheap, and it's a British pastime, and he took umbrage to that. So he is a squish, he's a liberal, and he is overseeing the local associations. But this was the final lineup. It was me, it was Matt Goodwin, David Starkey, Mark Littlewood. David Starkey will be on Deprogrammed this week, by the way, on Thursday. So, promoted it, all fine. So when I was on my stream last time, what was that, Thursday? While I was live, I got a phone call from one of the people organising this, and I couldn't take the call, but I called him back the next day, and I was told I had been banned by Reform HQ because I'm not on the approved speakers list. Now, I know for a fact that some people have already bought tickets to the event because they wanted to participate in this. Hear me speak. say unorthodox things. And I don't know the reason why I'm not on the approved speakers list. I asked around because I still talk to some senior people in Reform and received no answer. Someone that is senior in the Reform who objected to this cancellation gave me a call and said and advised that I say nothing, I take it on the chin, because they wanted me to be involved in frontline politics within the next 5 to 10 years. And they said, just out of experience, you have to, quote, eat a lot of shit in order to sit at the main table. And I just said, look, I appreciate that incremental approach. I admire the emulation of a leftist long march through the institutions. It worked for them. But just as you might get things done from working from the inside, if they have no external feedback, if there is no cost to ritualistically denouncing, deplatforming, ostracizing people that your enemies disapprove of, out of a risk aversion of being called far-right and racist and whatever, when, in fact, I mean, I get accused of being a squishy moderate by many people. And I think I'm a reasonable chap who accurately represents what the majority of people think, even if they can't put it into words. If you just allow them to have their only external feedback be, well, you're a fascist if you platform this person, then they're going to salami slice off their support base, their vocal supporters in media, in alternative media, in mainstream media, in academia, etc. You're going to shrink the ground on which you stand. You're going to make it harder to maneuver. And you're also going to estrange lots of, especially young men, who either follow various commentators or believe in certain ideas that you have considered beyond the pale, who you need to, not just as MPs, but to repopulate the civil service when you hire and fire everyone. This is what the Trump administration did, remember. They recruited from places like Claremont and American Moment. They brought their influences into the Big Ten. They had we are not going to denounce our own people. We are going to attack the media that we recognize as the enemy approach. And they not only won the election, but they had, in most cases, better appointments than the first Trump administration. And they hired our guys into unseen positions in Department of Defense, the State Department, etc., who are now doing good work. They're not doing as much as a lot of us would like, but they're doing much better work than the first term, and they have a Sisyphean feat of disentangling the deep state and actually getting anything done. So the gains they have made, like, for example, cutting the refugee list down to 7,500 people, and the majority of those are white South African farmers being genocided, after Trump put Cyril Ramaphosa through a struggle session of clips and headlines that show that he is neglecting a white genocide in his own country. That's the kind of gains you make by allowing our guys to get in positions of power because you haven't kicked them out of the movement. Do you know how you don't do that? Spend a week obsessing over Oppo research in Politico, a few edgy jokes in the group chat from young Republicans who aren't in those positions of influence, and denouncing all those guys and trying to ruin their careers publicly on behalf of your enemies who want to see you fail anyway. That same thing happens here when you ostracize someone who is of a decent profile, who has an audience that is disproportionately the young men whose votes you want to win and who you need as personnel. Now, the reason I'm doing this stream is not because I think I'm owed any opportunities. If you encounter anyone in Westminster who hands these sorts of opportunities out, ask them, and I've never asked for one. Being frank, this would have taken up an evening of mine. I wasn't paid for it. I'm not paid for this sort of thing. I would have gone along. I would have socialized, and most people who know me know I'm actually a bit of an introvert, hence the giant library behind me that I would much rather spend time reading. But I took the opportunity because they were gracious enough to ask, because I thought that it was an opportunity to make more room on our political side, especially if we are anticipating reform government. And so my frustration lies with the fact that my being blacklisted is indicative of a trend of risk aversion that turns your party into a vehicle for containment. containment on behalf of people who would like to see you fail. And failure is either you capsize and don't win an election, or in the process of winning an election, you morph ineluctably into being indistinguishable from the uniparty that you have sought to destroy. How you do that as well is acting as a refugee camp for the conservative politicians who ruined the country in the previous 14 years, and you act as a retirement home for them, or you feather the nest for the return of certain politicians who are unrepentant about their record. For example, Nadine Dorries, who, remember on Sky News, after drafting the online safety bill as culture minister, said that she would look into whether Jimmy Carr had broken the law with an offensive joke about gypsies under the Online Safety Act. This person has just defected to Reform and was celebrated at Reform's conference as a major win. Yet again, Zia Youssef. He is being put on every broadcast outlet as Reform's rhetorical pugilist and brand ambassador, despite not holding a elected position. Now, I don't really care, as someone who is quite disillusioned with democracy. I don't really care whether he's elected or not. I don't care if he's an appointment. I care about results. And there has been no consequences for his attempt to call the police on Rupert Lowe for bogus accusations that he threatened to assault, kill, shoot him. Because if that had proceeded, if Rupert Lowe did not have the assistance of people like me willing to put their necks on the line saying this is wrong, willing to, in effect, ostracize myself from future opportunities that were dangled as an implication in front of us to say asylum, if Rupert didn't have the public support that he had, if he didn't have the platform he had to refute these allegations, then he could well have ended up in prison. How is that trustworthy? So, as for reasons go, I mean, I'm assuming that I'm just beyond the pale because I've said something that someone didn't like and they've taken a calculated risk and thought, well, if we estrange someone like Connor, then we actually open ourselves up to the moderates, we can grow our support base, and most of the right-wing guys are going to vote for us anyway. So I think they're going to take votes for granted. I think we shouldn't allow them to take votes for granted. And I'm not saying that you should set up parallel parties. I'm not saying try and proactively split the vote. I'm not saying vote for left-wing candidates. Definitely not. I am saying, though, go to events like this. Challenge the speakers, challenge the local associations, whether the cameras are on or off, and make it known that you're annoyed. Because if they only hear feedback from their enemies, they're going to be salami slicing off their friends, and then by the time that they win, the recruiting pool is just going to be the people that ruin the country already. Or that don't believe in the mission, that don't believe the reason that they carried the Ming vase over the finish line and just dropped the vase upon victory. Now, there are a number of reasons why, otherwise, I could have been blacklisted for this. It could be my criticism of Zia, it could be my defense of Rupert, it could be my stance on Islam, which you know is uncompromising, it could be my criticism of the party's previous immigration policies, insisting they do mass deportations, insisting they get to net negative immigration, something that'll be coming up later. It could be Richard Tice criticising my article in The Critic from a long time ago, where I basically predicted the Rupert Lowe fallout, where I predicted that the issue of Tommy Robinson would cause a wedge between them and their base. Could be my guest slot on Dan Wharton Outspoken, given Dan is also very critical of Reform when they go wrong. And it could also be because Reform compelled one of their councillors to apologise. So, this is Alexander Jones. He's a Reform councillor. And after Anthony Williams, the alleged Huntingdon train stabber, after his identity was revealed, he said, reports suggest the individuals involved are not English, adding, it was prompting again discussion about the impact of mass migration on public safety. Anthony Williams is not English. He will never be English. He's of African descent. The man who was tased on the platform as well, ultimately misidentified by the police, poor guy, who's of Caribbean descent, and was let go without charges, he's not English either. So, recognising that an African attempted mass murderer is not of English heritage, therefore did not need to be in the country in the first place, therefore this has implications for immigration policy that would result in the safety of our people. That is beyond the pale for Reform. they have insisted that he apologise. Now, this apology was only to placate the likes of the people that think the BBC is still morally legitimate, which is why they ran an article on a councillor that, no offence to the guy, he seems perfectly nice and seems to be on side on our issues out of instincts, but no offence to the guy, nobody knows. The only reason the BBC ran an article on this guy is because you apologised. Is because they thought you'd be amenable to the apology. You had nothing to apologise for, you were completely correct, and Reform, out of a reflexive aversion to being called names by the people that ruined the country in the first place, seem to have compelled this guy to apologise. That is how things get contained. Cowardice. Stop being cowards. Again, you don't have to platform me. I'm not entitled to anything. I don't want to be an MP. It's why I just say things off the cuff. I don't think about self-preservation. I don't think strategically when I just say things that I know to be true that very other few people are saying. But if you do think strategically, it is very short-sighted to enforce a narrative that everybody knows is untrue on behalf of the media who want to keep enforcing it because they support the policies that made these atrocities possible. Nobody looks at Anthony Williams in the general public, mass attempted murderer, schizo, and thinks, this African man is English. So, Alexander Jones said something completely reasonable. I can guarantee that pretty much everyone in Reform HQ thinks the same thing, by the way, having spoken to plenty of people that work in Reform, and yet, out of risk aversion, he has been compelled to apologise. That is one way the containment works. Cowardice. And not getting feedback from your base. Not being in touch with the public. Not realising actually how much room to manoeuvre you have because you place too much premium on enemy media outlets. Here's another way that containment gets done. I'm going to bring it up again. My debate on The Spectator. So, the reason I'm going to bring this up is because I've got an update for people. People that were asking, why don't you take any form of legal action against this? Well, I can't provide a detailed update because it is in the hands of my lawyers. I can say, though, that judging by the Spectator's response to this stuff, it's gone down badly. The public reaction's disaster of me making noise about the fact that they've censored the debate has gone down badly. I don't think they're enjoying just how many people have been saying on social media or on all of their YouTube videos that they want to see the footage, because they realise it's not going away. And this started before I pointed it out, because I originally was pointed to the fact that people of their own accord were going on their YouTube videos, going into the comments, and leaving comments saying, where is the footage? And so, when I pointed this out in this video and suggested that people might like to make their voices heard, if they wanted to see the footage, now, Spectator and Michael Gove's tweets, Spectator's videos, even unheard events, loads of the comments are just, where's the footage? Where's the Catherine Birbalsingh debate? Why are you censoring people? Why are you trying to silence the discussion of the one issue we actually want to talk about, which is immigration, which Michael Gove, as the longest-serving cabinet minister of the last government, is implicated in? Why have you buried it? Why aren't you addressing it? Why are you trying to carry on as normal? Why aren't you listening to your audience? People are cancelling their subscriptions. It's not going away. And the reason that Tucker and Nick are in the thumbnail, and we're going to be discussing it later, is because this was actually the success of the Groyper movement. It was people who recognised that their issues were not being addressed. Originally it was immigration, and how the Conservative establishment didn't want to talk about legal migration, they only wanted to talk about illegal migration. How there were these unresolved contradictions about identity, when Con Inc., as it was called at the time, just wanted to focus on economics. How the Conservative movement was unwilling to be socially conservative. Who was the guy, chat will remember, who was the black fellow who was at Turning Point USA events with Charlie Kirk. And there were groypers who would go up during the Q&A and say, why is Turning Point USA, a Christian conservative organization, talking about how gay sex is conservative? Talking about how this guy who had promoted gay hookup apps in his spare time is conservative. Rob something. And he recently just put out a video, by the way, saying that white folks were to blame for the loss. Rob Smith, that's it. Rob Smith. White folks were to blame for the recent losses in Minnesota and Virginia and New York because you and the groypers were estranging the very marginal gains that Donald Trump had made among LGBT, black, and Asian voters. So, one of the reasons that the Groyper War was so successful was not just because they were ignoring these controversial issues that needed to be addressed as a question of America's existential survival, but also because in order to make those marginal gains with fair weather friends, they had estranged their largest support base, which was conservative-leaning heterosexual white men, who were still a majority in America, who are, despite their best efforts, still a majority in the United Kingdom. The idea that we don't matter in our own countries, as not just the vast contributors to the economy and culture in our own countries, but globally, the idea we don't matter is deeply insulting. And in a climate where every single group is allowed to form a collective identity and agitate for their own grievances, but we are demanded to be issue-based voters, individuals incapable of organizing as a community for our own interests. In that environment, it was inevitable that there was going to be an identitarian movement on behalf of straight white men. And so they fed this crocodile, and they're now terrified when it starts snapping. And what I'm seeing the nascent embers of in this spat with the Spectator is the growth of the Groyper movement, or equivalent movement. I wouldn't call them Groypers, because Groypers are followers of Nick Fuentes, based on the Pepe meme. But the growth of an organic discontent that people are voicing of their own accord on social media about the fact that they recognize there is an establishment here that doesn't want to talk about certain issues that they themselves are implicated in. For example, immigration. The impossibility of integration. The fact that English ethnic identity exists, and even though it shouldn't be a foundation for morally judging other people, it does matter. It matters to bind us as countrymen together with a shared sense of solidarity, with a common frame of reference for our culture, our history, our heritage, and the project that we are engaged in, what we want to pass off onto our children. But also it matters because the other side really hate white people. They hate them. And is their organizing principle. It's not Marxism, it's not postmodernism, it's not even liberalism, it's not often Islam. Frequently in various towns and cities across England. But in the case of New York and Zoran Mandami, he's not actually trying to implement Sharia law. He just hates white people and wants to take their stuff. He resents the fact that he can't make blonde women laugh. And he's written about this, so has Hassan Piker. So these people really resent white people on a racial level, even if we don't think in ethnic and racial terms. I don't like thinking in ethnic and racial terms as an Englishman whose, unlike America, Isles have been 99% ethnically homogeneous until the mid to late 1940s. It doesn't come as second nature to me. I take people as I meet them. I actually said that in the Spectator debate, and Michael Gove scoffed. But you have to understand the theory of mind of the people that have been brought into our midst, who constantly agitate for their own interests. And so, in retaliation to that, in America, increasingly in Britain, as we're seeing on X, you're going to get a movement towards ethnic solidarity driven by those at the bottom of the intersectional pyramid. Those who are disadvantaged and put at the back of the queue in their own country by laws and culture, and that is heterosexual white men, who are wondering, why am I contributing so much to a civilization who hates me? And why don't I organize as a we, the pre-political community that Roger Scruton recognized as the necessary foundation to resolve questions like economics and foreign policy. You need to agree on who has a collective interest first before you bargain for it in politics. You need that question of identity settled before you go on to issues. Why don't we form a movement that advocates for our interests? And that's what people are starting to say. That's why someone like Nick Fuentes has been so popular. And there is a lot of effort being put into clamping down on that. Anything that smells like an identitarian movement for white people in America, but over here for English people. Because if there were Albanian nationalism, as there is thanks to mass migration in the UK, well, they're pretty pasty, but they're nothing to do with me. So in the UK, it's a bit more particular than just white. And the problem that the likes of The Spectator have in trying to contain my debate about this topic is that just trying to shuffle it off to the side doesn't make it go away, especially when, and let's walk through this chain of logic. If I said something they didn't like in the debate, I was too much of a firebrand. I wasn't going to be contained by the vague promise of writing for their outlet or hosting a show for them one day, to be invited to the summer party, to become a Tory MP, to be a Reform spokesperson. If I wasn't going to be limited or silenced on certain issues by that vague promise of a lucrative career in Westminster and cycling through endless cocktail parties, if I wasn't going to be stopped in saying something incendiary that they thought was beyond the pale by that, then why do you think I wouldn't say something if you shelve the debate after you promised in writing to provide me with the footage? By the way, again, at any point, they can just give me the footage. This is all that I've asked them to do. They don't have to publish it on their platform if they think it's not up to the, as Michael Gove said in his email to me, imprimatur, their standard for what they put out. But the fact they don't even want to provide the footage for me to publish means that they don't want this issue spoken about in the way that I spoke about it. So the reason I'm saying this is because if you go onto a clip and you go into the comments, I have to expand this somehow. As I've noticed and given the thumbs up to, just if you sort by top, lots of people just saying, where's the debate? Where's the debate? Where's the debate? Where's the debate video? You can't put this back in the box. Social media has meant that narrative control, which was much easier when you could just leak to the press and talk to a few outlets in the ministerial rounds and hang the implied promise of MP careers or writing for magazines over their head. The age of narrative control when you could just do that is over. People on social media can make more noise than you can ever counter-signal or contain. You can go out of your way to ban them, get them deplatformed, censorship, etc. But as the indomitable presence of Nick Fuentes shows, no matter what people say that you don't like, that even I might object to, through sheer force of will and talent, people will defy your expectations, defy cancellation, and force the issue. And so, they're not getting away from something like this. So, what do they choose to platform instead? This is my question. What do they choose to publish instead of this? Because this should show you how containment works. Instead, they chose to platform a conversation with Fraser Nelson. Now, Fraser Nelson is well known as being the previous editor of The Spectator and saying some very unpopular things about migration. So Fraser has slightly changed his tune. I'll play the opening promotional clip of this debate because this is the perfect example of both an attempt at containment and a limited hangout. And you're probably thinking, well, this is unheard, so what does this have to do with The Spectator? Okay, I filmed the debate with Michael Gove and Catherine Burblesing above the old Queen Street Cafe, the Unheard Cafe. The room that we filmed it in is the same room as this. The room that Michael Gove films his podcasts in is the same room as this. It's the same studio. It's just rotated the cameras facing different backdrops. So they've made best use of the room by doing it sort of multi-purpose. Like one wall has one backdrop, one wall has the other one, and the cameras are just pointed in different ways. And that is because they're owned by the same company. You might not know this. if you aren't in the Westminster bubble. Unheard and The Spectator have the same parent company. And so, there might not be a strict editorial line that both have to take, but there are parameters in which the people that own the company would like politics to stay. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gotten involved in owning political magazines and publication outlets. So, those parameters are set by what the likes of Fraser Nelson and his interlocutor here, Unheard's editor Freddie Sayers, are willing to air. And let's listen to how Fraser Nelson has changed his tune very recently.
What I would advocate is that every single one of those boat arrivals is deported and sent somewhere like Rwanda.
Surely the primary moral duty of a government is to its own citizens before it starts helping people from Afghanistan or
of course,
Eritrea.
Absolutely. Again,
and we have our own poverty to deal with.
I'd like to see more than net zero immigration. I'd like to see some net negative immigration for a while. I think when you look at what happened during the Boris Johnson era, that was way out of control. Multiculturalism is a mistake. We should have one homogenizing British culture open to people of all faiths and all colours. I don't think any kind of test can be applied to a human being to work out, do you fit or do you not?
So, notice the contradiction at the end there, saying that we should have a comprehensive British identity that encompasses all faiths and all cultures, and we can't apply a test of whether or not you fit into that definition. So he's unwilling at any point to exclude someone from the consideration of British. So the entire world is British in waiting. So he's not willing to draw distinctions between peoples. Check out his trigonometry interview with Konstantin Kissin, where Konstantin is exasperated when he insists that Rishi Sunak is English, and he says he's brown Hindu. Of course he's not English. He's Indian. Obviously true. But Fraser Nelson's changed his tune from saying that in the Telegraph a couple of years ago, the Boris wave was an accident, not a conspiracy. He's now saying he wants net emigration. He's saying he wants an outflow of people. Now, for him, immigration is a purely logistical issue. He's waiting for public services and the economy to catch up with the ability to accommodate all of those Britons in waiting. Because he's not drawing a qualitative distinction between people, because he's obviously just admitted that literally anyone can be British. But what's interesting is that he has pivoted from saying we should take in Afghans and Eritrean refugees. We have a moral duty as a wealthy nation to do so, to saying, well, of course, the duty of a government is to its people first and foremost. He can't define that people, remember. He thinks literally everyone is British. So, he has tweaked his line somewhat. But the entire purpose of this limited hangout is not to get Fraser Nelson to say slightly more right-wing things on immigration. I mean, that happens in the course of it. Those are those drip-fed opening fissures of public discontent with the migration debate that they can't quite contain. The point is to continue pushing Fraser Nelson's line that crime isn't actually going up. He's based it on this crime survey that was brought in under the Thatcher government that says, well, on the whole, look at my graph, all crime is going down. Now, specific crimes are going up. There's a rape reported every hour in London. Stabbings and knife murders are increasing. And that's mainly among and driven by people who aren't English. So, knife crime in the capital city, 60 to 70% committed by black men. A third to a quarter of all sex crimes in the country are committed by foreign nationals. And that's not broken down by ethnicity because we don't collect that data. Half of all sex crimes in London are committed by foreign nationals. Again, not broken down by ethnicity. So all the rapes in London, well, not all, but the majority of rapes in London are driven by non-English men. Which makes sense because London is less than a third English now. Which means that every single one of those people doesn't need to be here. But that's an uncomfortable thing for all Fraser Nelson to admit. So instead, what is being platformed, rather than my debate with The Spectator, what is being platformed is a conversation with Fraser Nelson where he says, don't look here, there's nothing wrong. The point is to contain the migration debate, to ensure it only progresses at a pace which people who do not want to talk about ethnic differences are comfortable with. So, why is this relevant? Well, Fraser Nelson used to be the editor of The Spectator. And he wrote about Michael Gove taking over from him. And this was in September of 2024. He helped make the announcement. Now, I know for a fact, because of someone familiar with the development at the time, who told me in, I want to say, November of 2023, that Winston Marshall, the famous podcaster, formerly of Mumford & Sons, went independent from The Spectator, where he used to host his show, because Fraser Nelson had called Winston's father, Paul Marshall, a racist. That led to Winston walking away. When Paul Marshall, Winston's dad, bought The Spectator, Fraser Nelson was shown the door and replaced with Michael Gove. Michael Gove is a longtime friend of Paul Marshall. You might not have heard the name Paul Marshall, but by the time we have finished this podcast, he will be very relevant to how the media is captured, contained, or at least owned on the British right. Right before Fraser departed from the Telegraph, he wrote this piece, because he did his last column in the Telegraph along the same time that he departed from the Spectator and went over to the Times. And there's a reason that he wasn't hanging around at the Telegraph either. This was on the 26th of December. Britain's integration miracle is a beacon of hope amid instability. Now, the substance of the piece is actually less important than its title. And this is often the case with Fraser Nelson, because Fraser Nelson says knowingly false things in his title to try to desperately gaslight the nation on certain issues like migration, and nobody really cares about the substance of his piece because it's all bollocks. But it was insulting that he put this out. So insulting that Sam Bidwell, who has been publicised now, is basically leading Robert Jenrick's campaign, which is why he is so slick and doing all these videos and talking about migration a lot more. Sam Bidwell wrote this piece in The Critic. He compared Fraser to Hiro Onoda, you know, that Japanese soldier who was found in, I think it's a Malaysian jungle 40 years after the Second World War, still clutching his rifle, believing the war was going on. And during his piece, Sam criticised the fact that there were 4 pro-Gaza independent Muslim MPs elected at the last election, that the Boris wave has demographically and aesthetically disfigured our country, rendering whole areas of the country unrecognisable. And he brought up the grooming gang scandal, Pakistani rape gang scandal. And if you're wondering why the scandal reignited and gained global attention at the end of 2024, the start of 2025, it's because of this exchange. It's because of Fraser Nelson's original article. This was an inadvertent containment breach, because the containment was so obvious, so desperate, so insulting, that the conversation that opened up on Elon Musk's liberated X, for which we should all be thankful, then led people to point out the obvious absurdities, the chinks in Nelson's armour. And Nelson is actually so bad at containment that if you were employing him to break containment, I wouldn't notice the difference. But Sam put this article out, and Fraser said, "My argument is that Britain overall has handled demographic change well, not that there are zero problems. We have huge problems, but outnumbered by even bigger successes. Managing this change is a British value, it is our national norm." This is why the containment operation is being run. They want this to continue. Why? I have come to the conclusion that some people just desperately want to be led by a non-white person. I've come to that conclusion from conversations that I've had with some of these people. Notably, Neil Ferguson, in a conversation I had with him for Courage Media at ARC, I asked him to make the case for Kemi Badenoch, given she is tanking in the polls. He's been a long-time friend and supporter of hers, and I think she's an unmitigated disaster. And he said, and I'll paraphrase, "White men like you and me are yesterday's news. We're a dying breed. Immigration is the future of this country." He once said on Trigonometry that his mixed-race children are better looking than his white children from his previous marriage, which was a strange statement to make. And he said that we need someone from that heritage, basically an immigrant, to lead the country to make the case for integration for those children. And so I think it's that partially there's an anxiety about being called racist from these people. They mix in educated circles. They are anywheres that consider themselves right-wing. So they're not rooted in one place, in one tradition. They don't need a sense of familiarity and solidarity among their countrymen. And so they actually feel flattered and have all their opinions validated when an educated person who is not the same ethnicity of them, comes along and tells all of their positions, repeats all their opinions back to them. And so they want to astroturf them, exalt them, push them up through the ranks. And this happened with Kemi Badenoch, by the way. Kemi Badenoch worked at The Spectator under James Forsyth. James Forsyth was Rishi Sunak's leading political advisor. James Forsyth is married to Allegra Stratton. Allegra Stratton was the Downing Street press officer of whom a tape leaked during the COVID lockdowns, laughing about the fact that they were having parties under lockdown and how she was going to spin it to the press. And she was ultimately scapegoated and resigned as part of Boris Johnson's government. This was the first domino to fall in Boris Johnson's Partygate scandal. Boris Johnson was deposed, including by longtime rival Michael Gove, who Boris beat for the leadership competition. Liz Truss was then elected by the members, which wasn't part of the plan because it was meant to be Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak has been supported throughout his career by the likes of Lord Ashcroft, a very wealthy Tory donor who is now donating heavily to reform. He's friendly with Isabel Oakeshott, Richard Tice. Lord Ashcroft wrote Rishi Sunak's biography, I think it was, but he introduced him to politics. And he is friends with Munira Mirza, who is the person who ran the Race Equality Committee that Kemi Badenoch basically made her household name on, fighting BLM as a based black woman to debate Kimberly Crenshaw and Diane Abbott, to refute the idea that racism is abound in Britain because she personally succeeded, with the implication, of course, being that if she hadn't succeeded, Britain would be racist. And Munira Mirza is married to Dougie Smith, and Dougie Smith is a shadowy fixer who's been compared to Mr. Wolf from Pulp Fiction, who is on the Conservative Party payroll. And whenever you ask questions, according to unnamed MPs in the Telegraph, about why he's on the payroll and exactly what he does, those questions mysteriously disappear, with the implication being, of course, that if you ask too many questions, so will you. Dougie Smith, by the way, used to run sex parties for a company called Fever out of stately homes. I wonder if there are any photos or compromat material floating around out there. To her credit, Nadine Dorries actually raised this issue in her book The Plot, which reads like a total schizo fever dream, but some of it is true. And Michael Gove is friends with these people. And Kemi Badenoch has been supported by them all of her career. So there is a big club, and none of us are in it. And that big club includes Fraser Nelson, who apparently wrote Kemi Badenoch's maiden speech in the Commons, who was, of course, the editor of The Spectator while she worked there. And it seems that Fraser Nelson, like his friend Neil Ferguson, like Michael Gove, is obsessed with being led by someone who isn't English, because he can't even define who an English person is. And maybe it's so he doesn't get called mean names. Maybe it's because he is an ideological liberal committed to the idea of the blank slate. I don't actually know the reason, but whatever reason, he is very uncomfortable with any discussion about immigration, identity, ethnicity, and the idea that integration into this big, grey, goo egalitarian vat is not possible. And so, inadvertently, Fraser Nelson produced a containment breach because the most egregious example of integration not working, of there being ethnic differences, is Pakistani clans of cousins drugging, kidnapping, torturing, raping, and murdering children because they're white and aren't Muslim. Like, you can't get a more egregious example of integration not working, of it not being a fucking miracle, Fraser, than that. And it became totally obvious. So this exchange then escalated on X. Sam said, Fraser, thanks for coming back on this. I couldn't disagree more. By what yardstick has Britain handled demographic change well? We are a country with ethno-religious voting blocks, sectarian family courts, and de facto segregation in many of our towns and cities. Our parliament now plays host to MPs who live to serve the whims of particular ethnic minority communities. Just a few years ago, we saw open sectarian rioting on the streets of Leicester between Hindus and Muslims. Sam has written excellently on his Substack, which has gone quiet recently, about the undue influence of the Indian lobby on British politics. And as we go down, he says, I understand the instinctive desire to reject doom and gloom thinking. This should be a great country, and still is in many ways. It is depressing to hear people talk Britain down. My criticisms come from a place of deep love and concern. It pains me to see what happens to our country. And Fraser says, you talk about ethnic voting, but Catholics once voted as a group in the US and UK. We were spoken of as Muslims are spoken now. People assimilate and often come to defend the culture and values of the country they move to, as the last US election showed. Actually, no, the last US election yet again showed very marginal gains among minority communities. And instead, if white Americans, heritage Americans, only voted, you would have a complete Republican sweep. He says, but if you want to see demographic change working well, as Wren said, Adam Wren, look around you. Look at any successful team of people in the UK, business, builders, workmen, scientists, whatever. Look at their family backgrounds, religious ethnicities. Might they differ? And might these people be rubbing along together reasonably well? Not so long ago, the right, especially the young right, defended the open society. Now that you disparage the Blairite national values of tolerance, support for democracy and pluralism. Blairite? I'm not quite sure where this argument is heading, but some of your followers seem to. Yeah, it's Blairite because Michael Gove specifically, at the Department of Education in 2014, invented British values, which were listed off on a conspicuously non-white hand as tolerance, democracy, free speech, respect for the rule of law, and fair play. They are Blairite because Michael Gove, when he inherited the Department of Education, walked around his department giving out copies of Blair's autobiography, calling Blair the master. And Cameron and Gove called themselves the heir to Blair. It's why they refashioned the Conservative Party in Blair's image. It's why David Cameron in 2022 wrote a piece in The Times saying we were pale, male and stale, we were all white men, and so I decided to do something about that with minority and women candidate shortlists. That's also how containment works, by the way. If you operate on the terms of your enemy's morality, you engage on the same terms as your enemy in battle, and then you conscript from the enemy's side your own soldiers, then you're going to find that they surrender a hell of a lot quicker to the demands of your enemy. And so packing out the Conservative Party with congenital wets and diversity hires, turns out it meant that the Conservative government was quite literally Conservative in name only because it continued Blair's constitutional and ideological revolution throughout all institutions. It enacted gay marriage, it went along with the trans madness, it implemented net zero, it accelerated mass migration, which Blair's government said it wanted to do to, quote, rub the right's nose in diversity and render its arguments out of date. Consider my nose rubbed clean off. So when Fraser plays dumb here and says Blairite, yeah, you, Fraser, you know what you're doing. Even here, he says, if you make out that Britain is a crime-addled hellhole, and made that way by immigration, a theme that does well on X, this is the kind of reaction you can expect to solicit. That's why the facts about crime integration in Britain matter. That's why I made such facts the focus of my last ever Telegraph column. So the exchange continued. Sam went through statistics. And eventually the Pakistani rape gangs get brought up. It's somewhere in this post. But he says, you mentioned historical skepticism of Catholics. You're right. For centuries, sectarian conflict loomed over British politics. In parts of Scotland, these sectarian tensions continued in the late 20th century. If anything, this proves how difficult it is to integrate large numbers of people from different cultures. Most Catholics in Britain are of Irish descent. The Irish and the British are, of course, closely culturally related. They're also indigenous to the British Isles. Both are Northwest European cultures with centuries of interrelation and cultural exchange. By 1800, the Irish spoke the same language as their British counterparts. For immigrants, this crossover point probably came much earlier. Current waves of migration are relatively larger, more heterogeneous, and less culturally compatible. Even if we assume this process will be as easy as the integration of Irish Catholics into the British mainstream, why sign up for a lengthy and difficult process when we plainly don't need to? The core tension in our belief systems is about the nature of nationhood. Your definition of Britishness is loose and propositional. The ideas that you cite as foundational credos are vague and modish. Most of our ancestors would fall below the standard set here. Pluralism, tolerance, and support for democracy are important values. Often they are virtuous, but they do not alone summarize what it is to be British. We afford cultures across the world the dignity of anthropological complexity. We recognize they have social norms, which are difficult to penetrate. I believe we should afford ourselves the same dignity. I would never dream of reducing the culture of Arab, Japanese, or Jewish friends to a handful of rote-learned buzzwords. Cultures aren't just about what people eat and wear, they're also about methods of social organization, family norms, and a host of other complicated habits that we don't always see, but which we live out every day. I will note, really is a shame that Sam now has to work full-time behind the scenes because he is an excellent articulator of the issues. But during this exchange, the Pakistani grooming gangs got brought up. Here it is. Even if none of those figures were true, which are listed above, if crime was authentically low, earnings authentically high, and educational attainment authentically equal, you still don't address the negative political and cultural externalities of mass migration. We still have ethno-religious voting blocks. We still have sectarian corruption in places like Tower Hamlets, where Bangladeshis that ubiquitously as part of the Aspire party, dominate the local councils, are also running to be MPs for the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party back in Bangladesh. So we have foreign ethnic people on English councils dominating as an ethnic bloc areas of London who are running to be politicians in their home countries for their nationalist ethnic parties. Integration miracle, apparently. And he mentions, we still have dozens of towns, 55 in total now, which bear the scars of Pakistani grooming gangs who targeted young girls because they were white. None of these are the product of Islamism, they're a result of mass migration. Using a handful of feel-good anecdotes to obscure the reality of where we're heading is profoundly unwise. And it was this exchange that led to the debate between a chap who's now privated his account and deleted his tweet, and Max Tempers. Max Tempers being the most powerful Anon in Britain besides Kunli Drukpa, and we should respect our Anons, folks, and give them the credence that they are due. This 13.5 million view tweet was the one that caught the attention of Elon Musk, because this was the transcript from the 2013 Oxford grooming gang trial. It was Fraser Nelson's exchange with Sam Bidwell that was so egregious a lie that forced Tempers' hand to post this. And so, this is a key example of how containment can be breached. And this is an example of trying to bring the conversation back to a realm which the architects of our national immiseration are more comfortable with. This is why they don't like X. This is why they don't like you in their comments. This is why they don't like you in their replies. This is why they don't like alternative media. This is why they have buried the likes of my debate on The Spectator. Because we say things that are beyond their control, that are outside their comfort zone, that will get them pulled up on at dinner parties, that they cannot abide by, because it threatens their entire grip on Westminster, on politics, and on media. This is why Fraser Nelson has no audience. This is why he blocks anyone in his comments who bring to his attention the fact that he is lying, and he knows he's lying. But this is why he gets platformed on the likes of Unheard. Fraser Nelson knows he's doing this, by the way, because this was in October, almost a year on. This is his Times column. In Oldham and Rochdale, it was grooming gangs of mainly Pakistani heritage, but in Blackpool, white men acting alone. Well, actually, in Blackpool, it was also Pakistani grooming gangs, because Blackpool was the place where Charlene Downs was raped, vanished, probably murdered, and according to the men that were charged with her murder, ground up into kebab meat and served to people. And it was only the mishandling of evidence by police that resulted in a hung jury and the dismissal of the case. Her body's still never been found. Her mother is still desperately searching for her missing daughter. In Glasgow, drug addicts. Well, it turns out there's also grooming gangs in Glasgow. He says, same evil, different faces. An inquiry cannot confine itself to only one aspect of the scourge. Yet again, Fraser Nelson is doing what I think Morgoth called this squid inking. Sort of like throwing up a distraction to try and make the conversation more opaque, less focused, and therefore to distract from the ethnic and cultural and religious dimensions of the predation by this specific type of Pakistani criminal. The gravest moral standard that repudiates the idea that the mass migration policies that he has supported have resulted in an integration miracle. He knows what he's doing, and yet again he's trying to deflect and distract and obfuscate. He's trying to point to graphs to tell you that crime is low, even though it is higher than it should be, because there are lots of foreign criminals who should never be here committing atrocities that are completely optional. Even though he accidentally caused the containment breach that made everyone talk about the Pakistani grooming gangs again, he is, yet again, trying to distract from it by saying, well, you know what, the inquiry that the discourse that I accidentally started has inevitably led to needs to be much broader. It needs to focus less on things that I am uncomfortable with. He knows what he's doing. He's trying to contain it. And it is just inexcusable. So, this is him on Times Radio, yet again talking about crime, saying, I would make the unpopular argument this is an amazing country and broadly speaking, there has never been a better time to live in it. This was in August, again, after the Pakistani grooming gang conversation. after the protests going on in the summer because Hadush Kabatu sexually assaulted a 14-year-old girl after breaking into the country just 8 days later. The guy that was then let out and then paid £500 to piss off back to Ethiopia. Fraser Nelson, following Nigel Farage saying crime is out of control, we're going to deport our criminals to El Salvador, we're going to do a Nayib Bukele style approach, which again, even though Reform have blacklisted me, is an excellent idea. We should support that. Fraser Nelson was platformed by Times Radio, wrote in the Times, telling you, well, you know, your daughter might have been molested by an Ethiopian, but look at this graph. Isn't your life improving? Again, he is insisting on a line that we know to be false to try to continue to contain the debate. And he knows he's doing this because years ago, he admitted to doing it. This is Fraser Nelson 2017 talking to a European outlet. And he says, he admits his tactics, that you don't actually have to do anything policy-wise to address people's concerns. You just need to gaslight them with media by saying, I hear your concerns, and act as a kind of spigot, a pressure release valve for public discontent. You need to be a bit like a tragic play in ancient Greece. Have everyone watching, have everyone sobbing by the end and forgetting, via catharsis, the tragedy of their own lives because they have outsourced all of their emotions, drama they've just seen in front of them. I'll just let him speak for himself.
Watch her experience so far of her short premiership is if you persuade people that you're listening to what they have to say, that you don't reject their concerns as being bigoted or xenophobic, that if you talk in a language that is more in common with neglected voters than it is with the metropolitan fashionable elites, then that goes a long way. You don't have to come up with policies, you know, banning immigrants or anything like that. All you need to do is to basically say to people, I hear your concerns. I mean, let's look at David Cameron. He actually, I think, did quite a good job here as well. Nobody expected him to win a majority in 2015, but he did. He had a policy of cutting immigration by 2/3. Now, he completely failed in that target, but the fact that he had that target counted for a lot because it meant people thought at least he wanted to control immigration. And there are a lot of parties in Europe right now, and governments in Europe, who wouldn't even say that they want to control it. They think that that is dark territory that they don't want to go down. Now, it's funny.
But are you saying that this is only psychology, that as long as you say the right things, people will appreciate that, and that actual results do not really matter?
I'm not saying it's only psychology, but I think a large part of it is empathy rather than psychology, is trying to say to voters, I'm on the same wavelength as you, I understand your concerns, they are legitimate concerns. I mean, the concerns people have about immigration are all usually very, very rational. Where are these people going to live because housing is quite constrained? Where are they going to go to school? What impact will they have on the labour market? Will they mean my job is going to be less well paid? What about my children? Will they struggle to find a job? You need somebody to engage in that conversation. And when you do engage in that conversation, it goes a very, very long way towards establishing trust with the electorate and taking away the idea that nobody will listen to them apart from Le Pen and people like that. And this has always been the British way.
It has always been the British way to just lie to you. That's what he was saying. Lie. Lie straight to your face. Just lie to people so you continue doing policies that are unpopular, that you can turn their country into a bus stop or a job centre or an economic zone or a theme park. Just a revolving door of demographics that they don't want, that they vote against, that they complain about every opportunity they get. But instead, if you just coordinate your media message, if every mouthpiece has complete narrative ubiquity, if they all just say, look, we get it. Yeah, immigration should come down. Yeah, we should probably have some net negative immigration. You're right to want to vote for someone like Nigel Farage to get control of this stuff. If I just sort of insert myself into this situation and gradually make concessions on the position that I'm insisting and have insisted on for many years, then we can just tell you what you want to hear and then do the opposite. So if he's admitted this, if he's doing this time and time again, if Fraser Nelson has led to the inadvertent containment breach on the grooming gangs issue and then tried to deflect yet again, if he is insisting that despite these completely preventable crimes by Axel Rudikabana or Anthony Williams or the Yom Kippur terrorist from Manchester in October, Jihad al-Shami, or any number of these other crimes that have been committed, the grooming gangs. If he is insisting, well, you know, you can't draw qualitative distinctions between groups of people because then that would lead to the implication that they never needed to be in the country to commit crimes in the first place. If he knows he's doing that, if he knows he's just lying to us, and he's admitting that he's just lying to us, and everyone can tell that he's just lying to us, and he blocks everyone on Twitter who goes in his comments and says, why are you lying, Fraser, here's the real data, why did Unheard feel it was necessary to platform him? This is the question you have to ask. Why did Unheard feel the need to talk to Fraser Nelson about this? Why do they think that there was an audience for this? Why do they think this is an important conversation to have? Is it to challenge him? I mean, it would be valid if it was just to challenge him. But I am skeptical as to whether or not Freddie wanted to challenge him. Not just because of the contents of the video, but because, if you remember, when this girl went viral in Dundee for being recorded by a man named Fatos Ali Damana, a Bulgarian migrant who describes himself as a gypsy gangster, as it came out later, and has tattoos of guns on his neck. If you remember when she went viral and people were saying, why did she feel the need to carry weapons around with her as a small girl? Why did she feel so unsafe that she was carrying around blades? This girl was arrested, by the way, and not the guy filming her. Why did she feel that need? Freddie Sayers originally jumped in and said, is there any actual evidence that the 14-year-old girl brandishing an axe and a knife was bravely defending her 12-year-old sister from migrant aggressors? Or is this just another propaganda slop story that people who really should know better are falling for? Okay, immediate distrust of the girl who felt the need to arm herself. And then, when the Daily Mail put out an article identifying the man in question who filmed it, giving him a sympathetic interview, he said, and just as I suspected, the whole story of this girl being attacked by a migrant is confected propaganda slop. Good day to all the thousands of morons who amplified it and who piled on me for questioning it. Okay, just propaganda slop. Has he issued a tweet correcting this? Has he issued a correction for the article that Kathleen Stock wrote, I believe, joking that the girl was on some sort of reprobate? I don't want to misquote the article. Well, since that, this has been revealed about the guy. I'm waiting for you whores to get in my supercar. Describes himself as a gypsy gangster. Are there any gypsy gangs operating in Dundee? Well, this was in the last month, in October. A Roma gypsy grooming gang preying on girls, teenage girls, 14-year-olds, I believe, operating in Dundee. So was there a reason for this girl to walk around totally tooled up, Freddie? Was there a reason for her to fear when she and a teenage girl that she was friends with were approached by a gypsy man in Dundee? Why was it your instinct to immediately dismiss concerns about her being preyed upon by an immigrant man? Why did you choose to double down? Why did you then choose to platform Fraser Nelson to deny that immigration is causing an increase in crime? Why did this go out via Unheard, which shares a parent company and a studio space with The Spectator, but not my debate with Gove about the exact same issue, but with some very different content? Why was that not deemed up to spectators, but ultimately, possibly, OQS Media's editorial standards? And if you don't know who OQS Media are, well, this is the body that owns The Spectator. It was acquired in September 2024, shortly before, of course, Fraser Nelson was shown the door and Michael Gove was installed as editor. OQS Media is owned by Paul Marshall, who, again, isn't a big fan of Fraser Nelson, according to what I've been told, but with whom Freddie Sayers seems to agree. A lot. And Freddie Sayers is the CEO of OQS Media. Freddie Sayers is editor-in-chief of Unheard, CEO of OQS Media since 2019, and will remain CEO of the expanded group and become publisher of The Spectator and Apollo. So he is in the position of ultimate seniority over The Spectator. Over the past 5 years, Unheard has grown its audience more than 10 times. So they've got some success. Absolutely. Freddie Sayers said, "The Spectator is an iconic brand of British media, and one of the great publications of the English language, representing a wit, intelligence, and playful articulation of important principles that has no equal. It is a very different publication to Unheard, with its own politics, atmosphere, and interests, and we're committed to helping both publications develop independently, alongside Apollo, the international art magazine that will also join the group. Our ownership will not only add energy, global ambition, and digital innovation, it will invest in journalism and be committed to the highest standards with a dedication to the core principles which underpin a free press. Accurate presentation of news and free expression of opinion." Not that free, in terms of The Spectator, considering they won't release the footage. The point being, we don't know whether or not there was any editorial influence over The Spectator's decision to can the footage of my debate beyond that which Michael Gove took sole and total ownership of in his email to me. But we are seeing here a media ecosystem which is acting in lockstep to parrot one particular line on the most contentious and important issue of our age, which is immigration. They will allow certain views to go out at The Spectator, but not mine, despite the audience clamouring for it, without my instruction, and nobody buying Fraser Nelson's line, but he's interviewed. His piece goes out no problem. I'm just noticing a pattern here. I'm also noticing a pattern when Renaud Camus was brought on to Unheard to debate remigration. This is when Renaud Camus was banned from entering the country because he was going to address the Homeland Party conference, I believe. And he was challenged on his contentious topic of, and I can't say this phrase on YouTube because it's actually banned, so I will use a synonym for it instead. The large swap. Renaud Camus came up with the concept of the large swap. And in this video with Freddie, which didn't go down very well with the audience, people were saying that it was absurd, Freddie goes through the history of migration. And what's mad in it is that during the conversation, he pulls up conversations about the migration of German tribes from Saxony, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, towards Britain, to then mix with the indigenous Britons and the English Saxons to form the Anglo-Saxons. And then he mentions, as we'll see here, there's another map that he brings up. The Viking invasions. And he uses this example to say that Britain has always been a nation of immigrants. Now, first of all, if you have to reach that far back into the past, between Norman conquests, Viking invasions, and Windrush in 1948, there seems to be a long period of ethnic continuity that went uninterrupted that you are ignoring. But if you notice, and this is the absurdity of the attempt to have the debate, which is why it didn't go down very well over at Unheard, the map he uses says Viking raids and settlements. Viking raids. So immigration did not go seamlessly. It was not an integration miracle, as it turns out, with the Viking invasions. The Danegeld was not a great example of successful integration. So what happens here is they allow certain views to air in order to try to embarrass them, shoot them down, make them unpopular. And occasionally, that containment is breached inadvertently. So that causes risk aversion about taking an editorial line in future, which means that the likes of Fraser Nelson is consulted for his opinion on immigration instead. And certain concessions are made by Fraser Nelson, who has admitted to just lying openly in the past and telling the public what they want to hear, so that people who agree with Fraser can win power and then do absolutely nothing about the issues they've been talking about in a limited hangout for a while, and the unpopular policies that have ruined the country can continue anyway. So, I would wager that I said something that was beyond the pale in that particular debate, and that could not be aired, whereas the sister publication of The Spectator would like the immigration conversation to go in a particular direction. Alright, calm yourselves, I'm back. Again, I had potatoes in the oven, it's the most English thing possible. My wife is currently out to dinner, thank you chat for asking. So that's why I've she's not bothering me for attention while I'm currently streaming for you lot. So it's clear that whether or not OQS shares an editorial line, there is cross-pollination between the people who feature on the likes of The Spectator and Unheard. They cover similar topics, but from different angles. And that there is a clear discomfort with a immigration, integration, British values critical angle being espoused on The Spectator and on Unheard. Whether or not this is coordinated, one cannot say. But despite saying that they have different flavours to their outlets, there are still perspectives, conversation topics, which are considered beyond the pale and not worth platforming. Not up to the editorial standards, the imprimatur of The Spectator, as Michael Gove said. And I'm using this example to illustrate how containment and narrative control more broadly works. And this is from personal experience, just being in Westminster, being in these circles, having these lucrative opportunities dangled in front of me, with the implication that if I just don't piss off the right people, if I just play the game, then I'll get further. And I've had that told to me straight out by people who actually want me to go further in conventional politics or something. And I've already said to them, and to all my audience, I don't want to be an MP. You remember how Ron DeSantis got tanked when he was campaigning because the way that he tried to relate to people was inauthentic, and he ate hamburgers weirdly, and he wore like really large platform shoes to try and make himself look taller and more presentable. Like, why would I want to go through that humiliation ritual, first of all? But secondly, I'm not saying that would be me, but I'm closer to that than I am to Donald Trump, who can just enter a room and electrify it. Like, I'm an introvert, I'm a details-focused person. The only reason I can talk in front of a camera is because I barely notice it's there. I have very little camera consciousness. And so I would make a terrible politician. And so I don't actually want that. And so I haven't been willing to play the game. I'm entirely focused on the issues that I think will fix my country. Because especially if you have your faith as a guiding North Star, especially if you have a family that is dependent on you to act with integrity, not just to provide for them financially, which I do my best to do, but to make your country a better place to raise your eventual children in, which, God willing, will start next year. If you have that, you're basically uncompromisable. And this is why we need principled, monogamous, heterosexual Englishmen leading our politics. This is why it's so frustrating they've been gatekept out of every institution. I cannot tell you how many doors I've smashed my head on to find they are permanently shut in Westminster, in Britain. Because this is just another thing to notice as well. So there are a bunch of young guys on the right? So I've mentioned my friends Harrison Pitt, Charlie Downs, Lewis Brackpool. There are a few of us. But have you noticed how we've either had to build our own institutions or have had them built outside of the Westminster bubble, like the Lotuses, where Carl Benjamin has provided a lot of young talent the opportunity to either get started or develop their careers. And Carl is one of the few people that actually affords opportunities, but even he was self-made, remember? And he has been gatekept out of everything for a very long time. Isn't it strange how there is a lot of young talent? There are a lot of right-wing young men, just when men are going more conservative. But under 30, there is nobody with any institutional clout. There are, unlike on the left who train and fund and astroturf their respective representatives, the drawbridge has been totally drawn up for young men. And part of that is that risk aversion, that containment by habit, because they're worried that we will go off message, we'll just say things on social media as digital natives, that we won't be under control, that we've got too much energy and zeal and vitality for a sclerotic political system wedded to the way that politics used to be done to keep on a leash. And so, this is why we've had to build our own institutions. This is why you'll only basically find me at Courage Media. It's why you won't find me at The Telegraph, Unheard, The Spectator, etc. I've pitched them in the past, but it won't happen. It's why, at the moment at Courage Media, we're currently undergoing a restructure. The people that used to run it are out. I'm basically having to run it. And we're fundraising. It's not a public thing, don't worry. That's why I write for Substack. That's why I write for there. That's why I'm on YouTube. That's why I'm not allowed on GB News terrestrial broadcast, by the way, which is Ofcom regulated, because I was told to my face by an executive, you're a legal liability. When I think, yet again, I'm very sensible. And look, there's the effect of, if you're cancelled from everywhere, you know, if everywhere you go smells bad, check your shoes, because you might have stepped in something, right? There's an effect of it might be you. And hey, that might well be the case. It might be me, it might be that I'm too antisocial, too disagreeable. I did score 0 on agreeableness, by the way, on the Ocean test, so that might be why. But I'm friends with a lot of these principled men. I'm friends with a lot of these guys who, if they go into frontline politics, despite being gate-kept out of it, if through sheer force of talent and will they make it, they won't be compromised by drink and drug and sex scandals, unlike a lot of the Conservative Party prior. And those are just the stories that we know about. If I'm friends with those guys and they have respect from people who are also a virtuous character, I would wager that it's not necessarily me. I have my faults, don't get me wrong. And I don't expect everyone to like me, I don't expect anyone to give me opportunities, but if there is a pattern of very little young talent is being cultivated, the talent that has been amplified seems inauthentic, has no staying power, has no credibility. And the people who ruin the country keep getting the opportunities despite having no audience for it. You know, subscriptions are falling, viewing figures are falling, their politics is antiquated and not representative of the public, then clearly there's something going on here. That's all I'm saying. You should notice the complete deficit of talent, and you should wonder who is calling the shots, who is keeping those drawbridges closed, and whether or not they have good judgment. So, the reason I've mentioned The Spectator, Unheard, GB News, Reform, the Conservative Party, there's a few other outlets we can mention soon. You might not have heard the name Paul Marshall. Paul Marshall is, again, mentioned earlier, Winston Marshall's father. And again, Winston, nice chap, good podcast. I think he probably considers me a bit of a fringe or rogue figure. But always been polite. Paul Marshall is the hedge fund manager of Marshall Wallace LLP, one of the biggest hedge funds in Europe. He was a Liberal Democrat. In 2004, he co-edited something called the Orange Book. Now, the Orange Book was the Liberal Democrats' modernization handbook that Nick Clegg then used to remake the party in the image of neoliberalism, and then formed the coalition government with David Cameron in 2011. He ended up leaving the Lib Dems to support the Conservative Party because he was pro-Brexit. But he wasn't pro-Brexit over migration. He was pro-Brexit because it opened up Britain as a place for lucrative business opportunities. Because he considers himself a classical liberal. He's a disaffected liberal. He is according to his page on a government website, founding trustee of ARC, A-R-K, not A-R-C, that'll be mentioned later. It's a children's charity. Chairman of ARC Schools, chairman and trustee of the Education Policy Institute. He has written Aiming Higher, Better Future for England Schools, Tackling Educational Inequality, and edited The Tale, How England Schools Fail 1 Child in 5 and What Can Be Done. Now, the reason all of those points about education are relevant is because he was a non-executive board member at the Department of Education under Michael Gove. When he purchased The Spectator, he appointed Gove as its editor. He's been a long-time friend of Michael Gove. He then founded Unheard in 2017. He founded Unheard with Tim Montgomery. Tim Montgomery, who was the creator of the website Conservative Home. So, the most influential in-house Conservative Party publication, which ran regular polls that put Kemi Badenoch as the the most favourite MP among the membership, essentially propelling her career towards the leadership. Conservative Home, The Telegraph, The Spectator, Unheard all ran favourable pieces for Kemi Badenoch in the run-up to the last leadership election. Kemi Badenoch was first supported in a 2021 leadership bid, after Boris Johnson was outed, by Michael Gove. Michael Gove has been a long-time friend and confidant. Michael Gove put his announcement that he was supporting her in The Spectator. Now, Kemi Badenoch's office, group of advisors, are being led by Henry Newman and Francis Maude. Francis Maude was one of the modernisers for the Conservative Party and a long-time friend of Michael Gove in the early 2000s, alongside David Cameron. Henry Newman was Carrie Johnson's best friend, a pro-LGBT activist who marched alongside Keir Starmer at Camden Pride a couple of years ago, and again, an ally of Michael Gove's. So the Conservative Party is a completely captured institution by Michael Gove, who is a close friend of Paul Marshall, who has installed Michael Gove as the Spectator's editor. And this is why, when they work together at the Department of Education, this is why if you listen out for any time that something positive about the Conservative Party is mentioned, whether it's in Zia Yousaf's interview with Michael Gove at Reform Conference, whether it's by Charlie Rowley or any of Michael Gove's other advisors who now have media careers on GB News, why when you hear in podcasts, including people like Dominic Cummings, who was an advisor to Michael Gove at the Department for Education, whenever you hear something positive the Conservative government has done, in its desperation to reach for an actual achievement that they made in the last 14 years, what is it? Education reform. Who's responsible for that? Michael Gove. There is a coordinated media push to reform and rehabilitate Michael Gove's reputation, to protect it. I don't think that every single media outfit in Britain on the ostensible right should be a reputation protection racket for Michael Gove, the longest-serving cabinet minister in the most disastrous and treacherous Conservative government that the country has ever seen. I don't think we should be fed a coordinated narrative line that way when it is detrimental to the country and it is detrimental to the health of the right. Especially when, judging by the editorial control that he admitted to in his emails to me, Michael Gove is keen to censor and shelve debates about the most contentious issue of our time, immigration. Paul Marshall received a knighthood for his services to education and philanthropy in 2016. It's curious because Kemi Badenoch's peerages given out included Nigel Biggar, the author of Colonialism: A Moral Reckoning, who sits on the ARC Research Department's board. He heads it up. And he's also part of the Pharos Institute, which we'll be mentioning later. Also, Toby Young. And Toby Young is head of the Free Speech Union. Toby Young writes regularly for The Spectator. Toby Young declined to intervene in my dispute with The Spectator, which I don't blame the Free Speech Union for, but I do note his friendship with Michael Gove and Paul Marshall and Kemi Badenoch. And the Lords is particularly important at this moment because of the Telegraph sale, which we'll mention later, which is another media institution that Paul Marshall has been trying to buy for a very long time. So, if that is acquired, Paul Marshall will own the Telegraph, the Spectator, GB News, at least having invested heavily in it. Unheard, have his preferred candidate in the Conservative Party, and this is something that I don't know if anyone's talked about before, but I have it on very, very, very good authority. Paul Marshall introduced Zia Yousaf to Nigel Farage. Zia Yousaf being interviewed at the Reform Conference by Michael Gove. Zia Yousaf offering up Michael Gove's education reforms as the one achievement of the last Conservative government, very conspicuously. Zia Yousaf, who appears to have come out of nowhere, been given chairmanship of Reform UK, when he makes a mess of it by alienating local branches, calling the police on Rupert Lowe, and then quitting in a huff over the burqa ban. Nigel Farage then goes on GB News to encourage Zia to come back, and it's because, of course, Zia was in a position of privilege over the party and had courted lots of donors, which I'm sure were very lucrative to Reform. And then the very next day, he pulls a George Costanza and comes back as the head of UK Doge, And then now he's no longer the head of UK Doge for some reason. That's Richard Tice. So Zia is now just an autonomous spokesperson for the party that is sent out on the media rounds and has been presumably promised a safe seat in a by-election so that he'll become an MP. And, as well, Farage has suggested that if someone better looking came along, because he's, getting into his 60s now, eventually Farage might well retire after one parliamentary term and hand it off to someone, an heir apparent to Reform UK. And Nigel Farage has suggested that if we alienate the whole of Islam, we will lose, so who better than to win the moderate Muslim vote, insofar as it exists, that is growing, that according to Majid Nawaz, in an interview with Winston Marshall, Nigel Farage can win. Who better to do that than Zia Yusuf? Remember, Nigel Farage also said that in an interview with Winston. So, it's just conspicuous. That's all I'm saying. This might well be a very elaborate schizo post. But I think there are questions to be asked as to whether or not it is prudent to allow one man who is friends with some of the worst offenders in the last Conservative government to own a lot of the media in the UK, to have a lot of influence over political parties, to have attended the meeting following the barbecue with JD Vance when he was over in the Cotswolds. Marshall was there to basically pick and choose candidates for political parties. I think even if he has the best intentions in the world, we should question the prudence of his appointments, of his political instincts, and whether or not it's a good idea to have all of the established media and parties in the corner of one man. Now, here's a piece that is written in an enemy publication. It's The New World. It is a outlet that is associated with the New European. They're very anti-Brexit. They're left-wing. James Ball in question, the writer, even though he's written for Unheard and before, he was previously employed by the Bureau for Investigative Journalism, which has been funded by George Soros' Open Society Foundation. So, the only reason I'm citing this is because it accidentally stumbles on some truth here. Its prescription is, of course, that Paul Marshall is creating a far-right media ecosystem that is a threat to democracy and spreads misinformation. However, ignoring the content, this graphic is actually quite useful. So, and I say all this, by the way, knowing people that work for all of these outlets, knowing people that do good work in this, and not saying that there is one editorial line, not saying that they're entirely captured, not saying they aren't without their use. Like, I know people that work at the Prosperity Institute. Great guys. People that watch my stuff work at the Prosperity Institute. I know people working for ARC, trying to make it so that the talks at the next ARC are a little bit less temperate. Or at least, not 5 years behind the present discourse. And that there might be some more young people represented there. I do know for a fact that when they were talking about young people that should be represented at ARC, whether or not they should be on stage giving keynotes or involved in fringe events or debates, my name was brought up by someone who was saying, when asked, well, who are the biggest names on the British right? And just by audience size for under 30s, weirdly enough, I think it might be me. And when my name was mentioned, someone said something to the effect of, we consider Connor to be on the fringe of British politics. So that's probably a no. And I guarantee that this sort of stream, this conversation, is going to shut me out of that. Which is a shame, but yet again, I think it's just important. Anyway, so ARC, Prosperity Institute, GB News, Spectator, Unheard, Policy Exchange, one of the premier think tanks in Westminster, which is actually on the same street as the Spectator and Unheard, Barros Foundation. You can add to that as well the Critic, because of a board member there, that will be mentioned later. There are these, and also the Telegraph, which is being eyed up for a purchase. So, if you can name one actual bastion of alternative thought, if you can name one media venture on the British right that isn't reliant on or influenced by Paul Marshall's money, well, I'd be impressed. Talk TV might be the only one, but then that's obviously part of the News UK group, which is believed still owned by Rupert Murdoch. And I think, look, Talk's good. It has some good hosts on there, but again, they're still risk averse. They're at least risk averse. So, someone said Lotus Caesars. Yes. Yes. But that is outside of the establishment. As in, like, Lotus Caesars has only gained an audience because of the talent it has been willing to platform and the fact that Cole already had an established audience. Cole himself was a complete outsider. So, yet again, pretty much everything that has sway in Westminster is part of this network. And I just question the prudence of allowing this network to be the only basket in which we load all of our eggs. So there's some notes in here that are worth reading. Working with former Times comment editor Tim Montgomery, who is now a Reform spokesperson and advisor, Marshall provided the finance to launch Unheard as a new UK media outlet with an attached private members club, which is very nice, I've been to, which was genuinely heterodox in its views, signing up prominent writers from the left and from the right, often from well within the mainstream. And again, I know lots of good people that write for Unheard. Mary Harrington, good friend of mine, came to my wedding. Aris, he writes some good stuff. And then they've also got, I'd say, a safe line where they don't touch the migration settlement too much, but they make overtures at post-liberalism and they platform the TERFs. It says, both Unheard and Marshall appeared to drift rightwards in the years that followed. In 2021, obviously, Winston was forced to step down from Mumford & Sons amid a row over his endorsement of a book on Antifa by, and it says alt-right, Andy No. Andy No's a white nationalist. He's Vietnamese. This is the kind of biased framing that this particular article uses. However, look past the framing. There is actually a network here. It says, instead, it's GB News that attracts the real attention, not Unheard, despite being written off as a joke during its launch 4 years ago. And I remember the early days of GB News. You know, there were tech issues. Andrew Neil left in a half after only a few days. Paul was one of the investors behind the channel and used to be on its board. Andrew Neil left. Paul has since left GB News' board. It says GB News is not a profitable organisation, which is an important thing to note. Nor is it anywhere close to it. In its most recent accounts, GB News just made under £16 million in revenue, but it lost £33 million. A profit margin of minus 200%. That means the channel needs a new cash injection of tens of millions every year just to keep operating. Evidently, it's not being run to make money, it serves a different purpose. And the purpose they're saying here is that, notably, the likes of Nigel Farage, Jacob Rees-Mogg, formerly Boris Johnson, who was promised a deal but never seems to have delivered because he hasn't made any content for it, are paid quite a bit of money to appear on GB News. Which means that the megaphone for politicians on the right to make their views heard is GB News, part of the Marshall Network. And whether it's incidentally contained by the fact that Ofcom, the government regulator, only allows certain people or positions to be voiced, whether it's accidental risk aversion because GB News has a legal department, doesn't want to get sued, so certain things can't be said or can't be risked being said, or whether or not it's because there is a fostering of dependency going on, again, to be questioned, but all of those are vectors for narrative containment. Again, is it wise having one person own all of the media apparatuses and the two major ostensibly right-wing political parties in the country? And also, if you notice at ARC, Paul is a headline speaker every year. And it's because, as is written here, stories of the organisation's founding tend to focus on Jordan Peterson, or ARC CEO Philippa Stroud. And Philippa Stroud used to be she's a baroness, one of the key advisors and figures in David Cameron's modernisation of the Conservative Party. She also used to be the head of the Legatum Institute, which has now been renamed to the Prosperity Institute and is under much more prudent leadership. Again, people I like there. But the company's ownership, ARC, and its documents tell a different story. Filings at Companies House show ARC has 2 directors, Paul Marshall and another partner of Legatum. Persons of significant control over the operation lists Marshall along 4 Legatum partners. It was relaunched as Alliance for Responsible Citizenship in 2023, funded with £1 million from Marshall. Now, undeniably, ARC is influential. It has some solid speeches. Constantine and Douglas both gave good speeches in 2023 and 2024. Or 2025, actually. It skipped a year, didn't it? And there's going to be one next year. However, yet again, who is included, who isn't? To what extent are the money power interests behind this conference and all of the other media organisations and political parties on the British right influencing what is allowed to be said and what isn't? Is it prudent to have the same person appointing the same people to speak at and set the editorial tone for all of the outlets on the British right? And it notes in here as well, regarding media outlets, he's rounded off his media empire with the purchase of The Spectator and has appointed Michael Gove as the editor. It said, Marshall scored a coup over Rupert Murdoch by persuading Gove to take the editor's chair on completing the purchase, another former cabinet minister for his collection, and a longtime friend and ally from the Department of Education. Now, Marshall also gave the spring lecture for the Faros Institute this year. Now, you might recognise the Faros Institute's name in passing because Dominic Cummings gave a lecture and did a Q&A with my good friend Stephen Edgington earlier this year, where he revealed, for example, that Boris Johnson only did the Boris wave because he wanted the Financial Times to like him again, where he mentioned that, and this puts Michael Gove in a very good light. While at the Department of Education, he and Gove took the side of Andrew Norfolk, the Times journalist who is credited with breaking the story of the grooming gangs in the Times. When the Department of Education was going to take out an injunction against Norfolk, Gove and Cummings threatened legal action against their own department civil service if they tried to block the story from getting out. Again, commendable thing, if that account is as it said, but you see, the narrative is that actually Gove was the under siege, unsung hero of the last Conservative government, rather than present in every cabinet except Liz Truss's, because they didn't get along by the end of it, who championed lockdowns, who went along with trans madness, who has never had a problem with mass migration, who only wanted Brexit to make us global Britain, who did nothing to rid the Conservative Party of its drink and drugs and sexual promiscuity culture. So, Gove is a symptom of the Conservative Party's corruption and the ruination of our country, and yet lots of people are interested in reforming his reputation. Now, Marshall in here says, he finishes his speech with a quote. George Orwell used to say that the essence of journalism is printing what someone does not want printed. Everything else is public relations. That's my mantra for Unheard, for GB News, and for The Spectator. So it seems that The Spectator, under Michael Gove, is taking an editorial line that is not Paul Marshall's mantra, and is instead more focused on public relations for Michael Gove, or perhaps about the specific issue of immigration. It seems that printing things that someone else does not want to be printed does not extend to the publications that Paul Marshall has purchased and perhaps has just taken his eye off the ball of. Now, the other thing to mention here is that Nigel Biggar introduced Paul Marshall. Nigel Biggar is the trustee and the chairman of the Faros Foundation, or Faros Institute. And he's also the head of ARC's research department, which was funded with £1 million from Paul Marshall's Sequoia Trust, spelled Sequoia. If I've mispronounced that, I apologise, I am an idiot. What is Faros, you might ask? Well, Faros is an institution that funds, sponsors, researchers and academics out of Oxford, but across various universities, and encourages heterodox investigations. And yet again, like all of these outlets, I don't want to disparage them. I don't want to disparage everyone that works for them. I know some of the people that have been sponsored by Pharos and have done some good stuff. Patrick Nash, who I've referenced before, whose study on the case for banning cousin marriage for an Oxford journal, who is an absolute gentleman, who's very on-side. He is part of Pharos. So again, I'm not to say that all of these outlets are irredeemable or captured or corrupt or censorious or just containment, but there is an element of containment that results from one person and the friends that they install in these institutions controlling everything. For example, this chap here, Daniel Robinson. Daniel Robinson is the founding academic director of Pharos. Daniel Robinson I had an encounter with, that sounds wrong, a run-in with, at the Critics' Christmas Drinks Party in 2023. And he said to my face that Michael Gove is the most conservative member of Parliament at the time. Now, Gove had just been at the National Conservative Conference in 2023, in May, and did a sit-down interview with Madeline Grant, who he now co-hosts the Quite Right podcast with at The Spectator. Maddie used to work for The Telegraph, she now works for Specky. By all accounts, again, Maddie, very nice woman, so don't wish to disparage her. But when I queried that, because Michael Gove had said during that interview that the two achievements of the Conservative government under his watch were universal credit, so, you know, the expansion of the welfare bill, and, quote, the superficial and the intellectual diversity of the government, meaning just more non-white MPs and cabinet ministers, so diversity being our strength. Something that Gove repeated at the dispatch box in March of 2024, when he was announcing his extremism definition, co-authored by Dame Sarah Khan, whose sister ran Raiku. And Gove, according to a source quoted in Nadine Dorry's book, was carving off parts of the Home Office and putting it under his Levelling Up and Communities department. So he was obsessed with, you know, playing umpire with various community groups, including Muslims, which, you know, perhaps that was something I transgressed a taboo on in our debate. When I challenged Daniel's assertion that Michael Gove was the most conservative cabinet minister, he said, who else would you say? And I said, Miriam Cates at the time, who was leading the New Conservatives, leading the charge on restricting migration, talking about post-liberalism and banning pornography. And he said, quote, Miriam Cates is more National Socialist and National Conservative. So this guy, who was, and I remind you, Gove's former senior advisor on regional policy at the Cabinet Office and the Department for Levelling Up between 2016 and 2023, so a very senior civil servant in Michael Gove's corner, this guy said, well, one of the more conservative, socially conservative members of the Conservative Party is a Nazi. My standard for conservatism, the only allowable conservatism, the most conservatism in the country, is Michael Gove. He is in charge of the Pharos Foundation, funded by Paul Marshall, friendly with Michael Gove. And the other person I'd like to point out here, and I don't, again, wish to be rude, because she's always been polite to me when I've interacted with her, is Lola Salem, a name that might not be familiar to you. She's Michael Gove's girlfriend. Lola Salem works for The Critic. I think she's their business development director or something. And she is a Marshall Research Fellow. So her presence at the Pharos Institute is a direct consequence of Paul Marshall's funding. Like, again, it's too conspicuous not to see the tendrils of this network everywhere. You've got Pharos, GB News, The Critic, Unheard, The Spectator, The Conservative Party, Reform UK, and, as we'll see, The Telegraph. Paul Marshall was going to buy The Telegraph directly. Now, this was back in September of 2024, the end of September 2024. He pulled out of his direct bid to buy The Telegraph. So, David Affoon, who's the owner of the New York Sun, one of the oldest papers in America, the first paper to endorse Trump, if I remember correctly, is currently trying to buy it. And as well, there is another interested party called Redbird. Now, Redbird Capital are a investment firm. They're based out of Abu Dhabi, I believe, so Dubai. And there are allegedly links to the Chinese that are being explored. Redbird has been writing in the Telegraph, pleading the House of Lords to vote to approve its sale, because I think it was held up by Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy. So that means that people that have been put in the House of Lords that are amenable to this deal, like Nigel Biggar, member of Pharos, friend of Paul Marshall, like Toby Young, head of the Free Speech Union, writes in The Spectator, friend of Gove and Paul Marshall's, like Baroness Claire Fox, formerly of the Brexit Party, but originally of Living Marxism, runs Battle of Ideas, contributes to Spiked, regular on the likes of Talk TV and GB News, and friendly with Michael Gove, Toby Young. They're most likely to vote for this. This is why Fraser Nelson, part of this circle as well, has also been tweeting about this. It's quite a niche issue, right? Who really cares about who buys the Telegraph? Well, it matters if it's part of the narrative control. Because, guess who sold The Spectator to Paul Marshall? Redbird. So, is this a proxy purchase to add the Telegraph to the next lineup of institutions under the larger Marshall network? Because then it will be The Spectator, Unheard, GB News, ARC, Pharos, Telegraph, the Conservative and Reform parties, the Critic, and by extension Spiked. Spiked, who have, yet again, run hit pieces on the likes of me, Nick Dixon, Stephen Edgington, Harrison Pitt, and any young man speaking about immigration, integration, identity. And they've called us the very online right, or white identitarians, or they've just tried to tank our careers from the outset because we haven't been willing to stay within the parameters of acceptable political discourse set by these institutions that all seem to be moving in lockstep. I hope people are sort of keeping track of this, because other than the New Culture Forum, the Lotus Eaters, Courage Media, and Restore Britain, pretty much every other institution is part of this network. And that represents the Westminster establishment for the ostensible right in Britain. That doesn't mean that, again, there aren't good people working there. It doesn't mean there aren't good people trying to make their way through the institution, either keeping their head down or just doing their best and putting good work out. I've already mentioned, Sam Bidwell or Patrick Nash, or there are plenty of people that I won't name because I just don't want to cause them any trouble. If me pointing this out causes trouble for me, and then by association them. But it does mean that the people investing money in these outlets are making imprudent appointments like that of Michael Gove or platforming Fraser Nelson, who set certain editorial lines, who push fictions about the most important issues of our age, and their beliefs lead to preventable atrocities happening. For example, obfuscating the nature of the Pakistani rape gangs, which has time and time again prevented any inquiry and then policies that will stop them, identify the perpetrators, deport them and the family members covering it up. So, the reason I'm concerned for it here is because I don't want all of these outlets that do produce good work to come under the jurisdiction of one group of people who feel they have political capital to lose by talking about certain issues in a certain way that is necessary but either too soon or uncomfortable for them. So, conclusion to this particular part, because we'll get onto the America stuff shortly, and I'll wrap up about 9 o'clock. So in about sort of like 20 minutes or so, because I need to eat. You should be attending these events. You should be going to the Unheard Club events that happen on Monday. You should be going to the Spectators Live events. You should be going to local reform branch meetings, or the Conservative Party if you're still a member. Because remember, I got kicked out of that too. You should be asking questions in their Q&As. You should be leaving comments on their videos. You should be replying to these people on Twitter, on whatever social media platform you use. You should be asking why they wanted my debate footage buried, for example. You should be asking why every single media outlet is owned by the same people. You should be asking why the demographic vandals who belonged in the last Conservative Party are now getting comfortable careers dictating what is and isn't allowed to be said on the side of the political aisle that is trying to deal with the problems they created. You should be trying to circumvent the gatekeeping, the censorship, and the containment. You should be too big of a problem to ignore. The reason that Nick Fuentes was able to circumvent his cancellation is because, no matter what he said, he had appeal to a group of disaffected people who were sick about the way that their country was run and sick of certain issues, whether it's immigration or more taboo issues like Israel, that weren't being addressed in the way they wanted them addressed. Did they always behave, and do they always behave in ways that I approve of? No. Does Nick say things that I always think are sensible? Definitely not. Is he successful? Yes. Can you deny his ability to force the issues, and despite being ostracized from every mainstream outlet, every NGO, banned from pretty much every platform for some time, where he had to make his own website, Cozy TV, to stream to? Despite all that, can you deny that he is currently setting the parameters for political debate and forcing the establishment to react to him, and in the process lose an entire generation of young men? Is that the case? Yes. So, can that be replicated? Can people use their voice on social media, use their presence at these events in person? Can interested, disaffected young men make themselves impossible to ignore in our country? I think damn well yes. And I think we should. I think that you guys should be going to these events, registering for their Q&As, getting job placements, going to local branch meetings for reform or the Conservatives or whatever, and making it impossible to ignore these issues. If you are engaged in politics, if you want to fix your country, if you put principle above expedient opportunities and enriching yourself, if you care more about the country that your kids are going to inherit, then do not let them gatekeep and contain these issues. Do not let them, these complacent, wealthy, liberal types, gain a monopoly over every party and media institution in this country. Do not let them avoid the issues that will destroy us if left unaddressed. Do not let them escape the fact that they are often to blame. Point it out to them. I don't see why it should be our country that should be put in second place to their reputations. And I don't see why we should resign ourselves to being shut out of every institution, every conversation. Sure, we have to build our own institutions. Carl's done that with Lotus Eaters. I'm hoping to do that with Courage. My friends have done that with Restore. We need to create our own ecosystem that is impenetrable to these perverse incentives or these censorious instincts, this cowardice. Whether it's money, whether it's ideology, whether it's a lack of courage, whatever is the driving force behind containment and censorship, we need to be impenetrable to this. But these establishments still have power. They have money power in Westminster. And so they should be challenged. They should be challenged in the comments, in the replies, in the Q&As, at the local branch events, and they should be challenged by you. Because you should be courageous and well-informed enough to do it. And if not you, then who? So that's my encouragement. Do everything politely and lawfully and with credibility, but do it. Challenge these people. You cannot let them get away with monopolizing the one avenue to power, thereby the ability to, at a state level, enact solutions that we need to have. You can't let them monopolize it and shut out certain necessary conversations from consideration. So, let's go on to why this works if you commit to the bit. So this was the attempted cancellation of Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson. Mainly Tucker Carlson, because Nick Fuentes has already been cancelled and it didn't work. Tucker Carlson, obviously, has been platformed at Turning Point USA events by Charlie Kirk. He spoke at Charlie's memorial. He was the biggest cable news host before he was fired by Fox. He's now got one of the biggest podcasts. Tucker, no matter what he says, is committed to free discourse. Now again, does Tucker do things that I like all the time? No, I don't think having George Stephanopoulos' sister on as a nun from the West Bank who won't say that Hamas is a terror group just because of criticisms of Israel. Hamas, by the way, if they had the propensity, would attack us too because they don't like white people and they don't like Christians. So I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, the Christians that live in the West Bank live under the constant threat of not just bombardment by Israel because they're caught in the crossfire of their war with Hamas and the Palestinians, but also they have to make a lot of concessions about how open they can be about their faith because they're in Hamas-occupied territory and because Muslims do not respect Christianity. So I don't think, Sharia law is not as bad as it's made out to be. I don't think that Islam just means submission to God, as he said the other day. My criticisms of Tucker's misunderstandings recently of Islam aside, the reason that cancelling Tucker won't work is the same reason that cancelling Nick won't work. One, they have organic audiences. There are all these accusations about being paid by Qatar or being amplified by bots, and look, who knows, right? Definitely as true of the other side, if it is true for them. So I'm not interested in that. Put that aside. There are definitely an organic audience for Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes. And so you're not going to get that organic audience to abandon them just by calling them names. And there are accurate characterizations of their views. Yeah, you know what? You can actually hit Nick from the right, okay? You could criticize Nick for his previous friendship with Destiny. Destiny making some gross comments about children that Nick, well, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, hyperbolically joked about and supported. I think that's just odious anyway. Shouldn't have done that. You could say that he would have more credibility were he married and the cloud over his heterosexuality were not cast. And I say this because, yet again, we should have heterosexual white men leading the movements in our respective countries. If not just that, it makes it far harder to compromise them. Because something that Tucker and Nick did discuss on their stream is that the porn companies probably have back channels to intelligence agencies to try and get blackmail material on people. And so if you are caught in an uncompromising position because you're not just sleeping with your wife or something, then it makes you easier to contain, easier to make susceptible to gatekeeping. So we should avoid that pitfall. And also, attacks on JD Vance, because he seems to be our guy. There's a difference between saying JD Vance got his start in Palantir, so question mark, and, insulting his wife. There's no need for that. It's unbecoming and beneath us. But nobody's done that. I mean, Douglas here, and I like Douglas, don't get me wrong, he's always been very generous to me. I disagree with some of his opinions on foreign policy, of course, but as an Englishman, I have to credit him with tabling the mass deportations issue, with being consistent on English identity and understanding Islam and immigration for years now. So, not attacking Douglas. Douglas in here does highlight that Nick didn't vote for Trump, has attacked JD Vance, called Kamala brat, tried to boost Kanye's campaign when Kanye is not the most stable individual in the world. But then Douglas also attacks him for anti-Semitism. And look, there's no getting around it. Nick has said some insulting things about Jewish people, not just Israel. But the reason that line of attack won't stick is because, like it or not, there is an expiration date on Zionism among Gen Z. The best you can hope for is basically my position, which is I don't really care. right? I care about Israel as much as I do Iceland. My Jewish friends care about Israel. I get it. The only consideration I have towards Israel is I would like the same standard of nationalism. Well, let's not use nationalism because it's a 18th century French ideology and it's from the Enlightenment. I would like the same standard of patriotism, of national identity, of having a state to protect my particular people as Israel has. I just want what Israel has. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I'm not involved in their 1,000-year-old blood feud that they're currently, trading mortars and rockets with the other side on. Not my problem. That's probably the best you can hope for. The majority opinion, increasingly, and it's because lots of Zoomers are the sons and daughters of the third world, but also because there are taboos that have not been addressed by left-wing and liberal Jews who have that double standard for Israel and my country, who insist that Europe and America must be multicultural and liberal and refuse to discriminate at the border, whereas Israel can be an ethno-state. The fact that that contradiction has not been addressed, the fact that Jews who would like the same standard for Israel and Europe, who recognize that actually the likes of indigenous Europeans and Englishmen becoming a minority in their own homelands means that they'll become third world slums and Islamic countries that actually are unsafe for Jews, therefore it's in their best interest to support the patriotic, identity-conscious governments of those countries, rather than, as someone in Israel said to me when I got taken on the conservative rite of passage and taken on the tour around there earlier this year, which was very insightful. The reason I went is because you get to understand the mentality a bit more if you're asked about it. They said, understand the mentality of a Jewish diaspora as being, in Israel they're a majority, so they think, will our neighbours kill us? So they're constantly concerned about their national security. In other nations they're a minority, so they think, will white people kill us? So they're concerned about their ethnic security. So they seek protections for minorities in the law against majorities. And this is why you get this double standard. If you can't question that double standard, if you don't say that that double standard has not just led to atrocities committed against Jews, like the Yom Kippur terror attack, but against indigenous Brits, like the Manchester Arena bombing, the Westminster Bridge attack, the London Bridge attacks, 7/7 attacks, the grooming gangs, the Lee Rigby murder, the Reading stabbing, etc., etc., etc. All of the trucks and lorries driven into Christmas markets across France and Germany. List goes on. If you can't talk about and address that, if you don't have right-wing Jewish voices who want that double standard alleviated, who do exist, by the way, Paul Morland, Dominic Green, if they aren't the more prominent voices, if we as patriots can't talk about that, the idea that we are having the nation of immigrants narrative enforced upon us to our detriment, if you can't talk about that, then what you try to repress comes back with a vengeance. And that vengeance is Nick Fuentes. That vengeance is someone who has so little self-regard, so devil-may-care attitude to cancellation, that he will say the most transgressive, most inflammatory thing about it. Actually, this is the perfect example. This is actually the best piece I saw on the Nick Fuentes thing. It was from Chris Rufo, and I'll mention more on this in a moment. But he spoke about Baudrillard's hyperreality, the idea that technology can distort our perceptions and so cause us to engage in a performative overemphasis of things that we know are taboo in order to seek incentives. So there's a kind of race to the bottom for attention and rage bait and audience sizes and monetization. And what Chris points out here is said, the tone of Fuentes' discourse is not authentic, serious, or reflective. It is ironic, cynical, and provocative, the kind of thing that young men who have grown up on the internet learn, the kind of ironic distance between sincerity and what you say publicly, because, you could be cancelled at any moment for it. So you might as well embrace the cancellation, right? When Fuentes lauds Hitler and in another interview praises Stalin, irreconcilable ideological enemies, unless that you're talking about their opinions on Jews, of course, he is not expressing a comprehensible ideology that could be scrutinized in debate. He is engaging in a performance, which only becomes coherent when read as a demand for attention. Now, I'm not saying that Nick is insincere, But it is true that a lot of what he says is hyperbole, and it's said for effect because he knows he's triggering certain post-war taboos. He knows he's getting under people's skin. And they're among a group of white men who are disaffected, who have never had anyone speak up for them, who are public enemy number one of the ruling woke morality, who really just want to see someone stick it to the HR hall monitors and gatekeepers of political debate. They find in him a champion. No matter what the inflammatory things he says about the Holocaust, or the contradictory things he says about Islam, or the strange opinions he has on Lord of the Rings, they enjoy the fact that he is provocative, he engages in hyperbole, and he insults their shared enemies. And so those radical ideas then go through that general disposition of being provocative, being anti-PC, sticking it to people that they have no regard for. And so, if you try and engage in a coordinated denunciation and cancellation exercise, which, if you didn't want it to look coordinated, don't have the New York Times, this piece in the New York Post, Ben Shapiro's video, and this piece in City Journal all come out around the same time, and Mark Levin. You know, don't have it all come out around the same time. A coordinated hit will not work if you're using the same language of henpecking HR woke scolds that turned those young men away from those institutions, that made them not seek their respect, and that made them seek out Nick in the first place. It's not going to work. It's only going to cause them to double down. These tactics that were employed to clear out the Fusionist coalition in the Reagan years, or kick the paleo-conservatives and the VDARE types in San Francisco out of the 90s Bush Senior coalition, they aren't going to work in the age of social media, and they aren't going to work when the target audience is sick to death of being told what they can't say. Sick to death of being treated as if the jokes they make with their friends in group chats or behind closed doors are an offense, a scarlet letter that should brand them for the rest of their life and prevent them from getting any employment, should have them be shunned, should have them be social pariahs. And if you make those people social pariahs, guess what? They've got nothing to lose. It's the short-sightedness of this coordinated attack is what astounds me, because it's like, guys, did you not think that this is just going to increase his power level among people who you have already deemed beyond the pale? And that coalition is already growing. Like, here's a perfect example. There's Evan Myers, right? This guy shared the audio of this heritage staffer questioning why he was being compelled to go to a Shabbat dinner. Now, it was not mandatory, but attendance was implied because he was invited to the dinner as a heritage staffer. And of course, if you don't attend the dinner, the question goes, why do you have a problem with Jews? Which is the nadir of post-war morality on both the left and right. Because the absolute worst thing you can do is be racist. And the avatar of racism, the 20th century Satan, is Adolf Hitler. He was most racist towards Jews because of the Holocaust. So therefore, if you don't show due deference to Jewish people, Israel, the protection of Jews, then the question that you might have sympathized with Hitler comes into the conversation. And if you don't want that career-ruining question to enter the conversation, you go to the Shabbat dinner. Now, disclosure. When I went on my Israel trip, of course, we were invited to a Shabbat dinner. I went. I didn't engage in any Hebrew prayers. I said grace before meals as a Catholic, as did all of the other Presbyterians and Catholics that were in attendance. And I went because I was a guest in someone else's country. And I appreciated the dinner being put on for me by the generous family who invited us out there. So, much like reading a book that you don't agree with, I underwent the experience, and I went, yeah, not persuaded, but thanks for the food. This guy, however, was not in someone else's country. He was in America, a Christian country, at an institution called Heritage, named after preserving the heritage of America, which is Anglo-Saxon Protestant. As much as we Catholics may be increasing in influence across politics, in the State Department via J.D. Vance, even among Fuentes' audience, for example, the heritage of America is Anglo-Saxon Protestant. We can just say Christian, fine. You know, was it Maryland that was a predominantly Catholic state at the time of the incorporation of the states after independence? Correct me if I'm wrong, chat. But if heritage is forcing you to go to the religious dinner of another religion that isn't Christian, then it is that religion, that interest group, that is not showing due deference to the heritage, the people and the religion of America, not the other way around. And so, Evan Myers should have been allowed to not attend this Shabbat dinner without criticism, because, as a Catholic, he may have been observing a fast at that particular time, or, as a Catholic, he felt that he did not want to participate in another religion's tradition, just as you shouldn't be made to participate in a Ramadan feast or a Diwali celebration. But, instead, when the full video got released, this was the struggle session at Heritage. And the reason I'm playing this is because if there is anything that is going to alienate young men from a pro-Israel Zionist cause, if there's anything that's going to make young men skeptical of Jewish people in politics as a collective, because they think that they're being bullied into attending a Shabbat dinner, it is these shaming tactics that seem to be present in the coordinated criticism of Tucker, and thereby Nick Fuentes, and the cancellation of multiple Heritage staffers for not denouncing Tucker and not wanting to go to the Shabbat dinner. The point I'm making here is, if you wanted to lose an entire generation of young men, this is the way to go about it.
Thank you, Mike. That's a hard act to follow. Thought you did a really good job, and I just want to say I'm grateful for all of our colleagues who are speaking up today, and especially for our colleagues on the National Task Force to Combat Anti-Semitism. I'm especially grateful for their work. I also have a question about it, given some of the leaks that occurred yesterday. Right now, the National Task Force to Combat Anti-Semitism is demanding that Heritage host Shabbat dinners with Heritage interns and junior staff. The faith of many Christians here at Heritage, myself included, would prevent us from attending these dinners in good conscience. As you know, for many Christians, Friday is a special day of prayer and abstinence to commemorate the death of Christ. I assume that no staff will be required to attend the Shabbat dinners, but my concern is that these dinners will serve as a sort of informal litmus test, and I'm worried that they will hurt many Christians who are not anti-Semitic but don't feel comfortable attending a Shabbat dinner. I would like to know how you guys would respond to that concern, and how we can be sure that the dinners won't be used that way when the people requesting them or someone has already been leaking them to the media.
Thanks, Evan. The recommendations, and that was the word, there was no demand was made. That is a gross mischaracterization of what was issued by the co-chairs of the Anti-Semitism Task Force yesterday, of which I am one. And I take some offense to that characterization. This was a recommendation, one of 6 recommendations that the co-chairs came to in consultation with the task force to try to provide Dr. Roberts with a path forward. As I said, they were recommendations. They came out of the conversation, which we were grateful to have with you on this topic. And one of the offers was if any Heritage staff would like to participate in this kind of a dinner as an educational exercise, not as a betrayal of their faith, that was an open offer from the task force. It was made in generosity of spirit and in the hopes of increased dialogue on this issue. And Evan, I'm deeply sorry that you could not see that as a generous offer, but rather a personal attack on you. It was not.
You know, I'm sorry that you're upset. I'm sorry that you offended me. Not an apology, it's passive aggressive, it's HR speak. This should not be going on in a conservative institution called the Heritage Foundation. And the very fact that questioning it then resulted in implications of his anti-Semitism proved his point. So, if anti-Semitism task forces are going to engage in essentially struggle sessions with principled Christians who ask polite questions as to whether or not they have to attend a Shabbat dinner, and asking whether or not it is implied to be mandatory, and then publicly shamed, proving it's thereby mandatory if you want to avoid the public shaming, and then it's leaked to the media. If you wanted Anti-Semitism Task Force to increase anti-Semitism, that's the way to go about it. Now, I'm not saying it has that effect on me. I am saying it has that effect on a generation of young men, especially the ones that want to get into politics and are worried that a false accusation of Jew hatred is going to be a career ender for them. Like, the great irony of this as well, the short-sightedness of it is right-wing Christians who respect strength, who are increasingly more focused on identity considering it is under threat, and as T.S. Eliot said in Notes on Culture, you only really identify a thing when it's brought into conflict with its antonym. So mass migration has caused a salience of identity among heritage Americans, among Englishmen. If you had a recruiting ground for people that were like, oh, there's like an ethnocentric state that features a bunch of Christian holy sites and bombs jihadists and rejects third worldism, who just hate them because they code white. If you had a recruiting ground for people that were like, yeah, I kind of see it, it would be these guys, right? In the same way that the Japanese are really different from me, right? They're a completely different ethnic group, completely different religion. I don't speak their language beyond a couple of passable phrases that my wife has taught me. But when I visit, one, I like the architecture and food, but two, I respect their difference. I respect them as a, frankly, ethnocentric civilization that looks out for their own. If there were ever a group of men who might be amenable to an argument for, basically, a militaristic, ethnocentric, theocratic state, which Israel basically is, it just LARPs as a liberal democracy, and then, for some reason, thinks that saying, well, we have a big pride parade in Tel Aviv is going to be a winning point for social conservatives. If there were ever a recruiting ground, it's those guys. Now, I'm not advising you pitch yourselves to those guys. Again, I'm not Israel's PR department. But you know how you don't win those guys? Threaten to ruin their careers for not going to a Shabbat dinner. Attacking some of the prominent podcasters and attempting to denounce them, rather than having an honest conversation about why there are so many, as Dennis Prager and Ben Shapiro and Charlie Kirk have acknowledged before, liberal Jewish organizations pushing for mass migration, or permissive criminal justice policies via the Open Society Foundation, and why they're content with this double standard. When Israel can be militaristic and ethno-nationalist, but America, Australia, the UK, Europe has to take in infinity migrants, including limitless numbers of jihadists. Why, for example, me at NatCon, during the Kurt Mills and Max Abrams debate, why, as I raised, Israel's military action, which we're meant to support, and look, I think we would be justified in bombing Pakistan for the grooming gangs, so I get why they retaliated to October 7th the way they did. But apparently I'm meant to support that, even though it's halfway around the world, even though American tax money's going on it. But it results almost inevitably in Palestinians ending up in my country, putting my countrymen at risk. Why am I meant to support that? And I asked that actually while I was out in Israel, and I don't think I got a satisfactory answer. I'm not going to say what was said, just because of confidentiality, but I don't think that the people that they put on our tour gave a good enough answer for that. There was a kind of nonchalant, well, your leaders should deal with that. Okay, well then, sorry, you don't have my support. And you know how you don't have my support as well? When you question that sort of thing, and then you get cancelled for it by an anti-Semitism task force in a supposedly conservative organisation. And you know who else agreed with that? Not Nick Fuentes. Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk, before he was murdered by, according to the Discord leaks, a trooned out leftist, allegedly, of course, because the trial's still going on. Charlie Kirk expressed frustration in a group chat with losing Jewish donors because he wouldn't uninvite Tucker from AmericaFest. Because he was willing to have Tucker speak to a large audience, because he was willing to have the debate between Dave Smith and Josh Hammer. He was complaining that, quote, Jewish donors play into all the stereotypes. I cannot and will not be bullied like this. leaving me no choice but to leave the pro-Israel cause. If you are losing Charlie Kirk, then the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Charlie Kirk was attacked by the Groypers for being too pro-Israel, and the tactics, like what was used against his heritage soffer, lost Charlie Kirk. The gatekeeping, the censorship, the containment operations lost Charlie Kirk. So, I merely suggest to the people who, and the reason I'm saying this is because people freaked out when I pointed out all of this stuff in a condensed version on Twitter, including some Jewish friends who otherwise agree with me on other things. I merely suggest that if you don't want to lose an entire generation, and if you don't want people Juiceburging, maybe don't cancel people for having conversations about it. Don't myopically make the national politics of America or Britain or something else about the Israel issue if you don't want people asking uncomfortable questions about it. You can't center an issue and then try and control the entire conversation as only being held on the terms that you think are acceptable, and then hold the threat of career-ending cancellation over the people that wander off the reservation, because if enough people wander off the reservation, if enough people get cancelled, if you give enough people nothing to lose, then they find their champion, who is just going to question all those taboos, and you aren't going to be able to cancel him. Ta-da! Nick Fuentes, who has a loyal audience of organic young men. And I use Charlie Kirk for this, because in the spirit of good relations, Charlie Kirk raised this to Bibi Netanyahu, and in his letter to him, he said to Netanyahu, I often spend all my time on these campus tours defending Jews in Israel, which I'm proud to do because I love Israel and I love the Jewish faith. I spent endless hours with Dennis Prager over the years studying the Torah. Sometimes it feels I'm defending Israel in public more than your own government. So Charlie, God rest them, was very connected to Israel as a land, the Jewish religion, Jewish people. It's a thing that I don't have, so I don't make it my issue. And he says, my campus visits are becoming like a rock concert atmosphere filled with conservative patriots, yet on these campus visits I'm constantly confronted with, Israel is an apartheid state. Why does Israel conduct ethnic cleansing? Why is America subsidizing Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people? Is American aid helping to subsidize Israel's free healthcare? That seems to be true, and abortion is legal in Israel. So that is actually an area of serious criticism that everyone on the conservative side should have, no matter your feelings on Israel. Israel and the Jews are running US foreign policy. Israel and the Jews are responsible for 9/11. Defending Israel is not in the US national interest. Why is Israel trying to drag us into a war with the Middle East? Above are just a sampling of the negative Israel-Jewish comments and questions I confront on college campuses. I'm accused of being a paid apologist for Israel when I defend her. However, if I don't defend Israel strongly enough, I'm accused of being anti-Semitic. That is so true. Whether it's bots, whether it's anonymous accounts, or whether it's face-to-the-name influencers, if you do not take the approved line on Israel, if you take even an apathetic or a dispassionate line, if, as I did when I visited, and just repeated some of the things that I heard from people on the trip about the double standard between Israeli nationalism and liberal multiculturalism in Europe, you're accused of being anti-Semitic. At the same time, I was accused of being a Zionist shill for even taking the trip in the first place. As you can see, my lips are wall dust free. So this just puts people off. If you don't want to go to the Shabbat dinner, you're accused of anti-Semitism. If you don't support the bombing of the Iranian nuclear facility, for example. And look, it seems that operation went off pretty successfully without Trump embroiling American troops on a boots-on-the-ground war, so seems to have worked out well in the end. But there are, as Trump once said, very fine people on both sides of that debate, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists because they should be condemned totally, etc., etc. But the people that were saying, do we really want to get involved in another bombing operation in the Middle East? Is it in America's interest? They were accused of anti-Semitism. So, if you want to estrange people from your position, keep calling them names. You force them into the position where they have nobody to support but the one guy you can't cancel. Not a very wise strategy. And the reason I'm saying this is connecting to the previous conversation. If every single media outlet and political party and big conference and think tank, every opportunity is owned by the same network of people. If they have gatekept out certain ideas, if they've gatekept out young men who are living in the aftermath of their policies and therefore only have those ideas to talk about, if they draw up all the drawbridges for those young men, do you know what you cause? You cause those young men to have nothing to lose by criticizing you, talking about the things that you don't want to talk about, and thereby you create a legion, an entire parallel power base that sets the political agenda and forces you to react to it, despite you having more money, more institutional power, and you can't cancel those people. And I just would humbly suggest to the British right, learn from the rise of Nick Fuentes. Because if you don't like him, they don't, if you gatekeep out all young men from these institutions and you don't talk to them beyond limited hangouts about the issues they're concerned about, you will create more Fuenteses, more Groypers, and a few years down the line, you will not be able to contain this conversation. And it will go to places that you find ugly. And it will go to places that even I find ugly. But you won't be able to stop it. So perhaps listen to Charlie Kirk from Beyond the Grave. Perhaps have a very sensible discussion about, in the American context, foreign policy, or the undue influence of liberal Jewish organizations over immigration policy, like the Anti-Defamation League, who invented the Nation of Immigrants narrative. Or even anti-Semitism task forces in right-wing organizations that influence Congress to push an anti-Semitism definition in response to the pro-Hamas occupations of American college campuses, whereas for over a decade, people were completely silent about the anti-white discrimination that has resulted as a consequence of the Civil Rights Act, and that discriminated against white men and put them at the back of the queue in their own country, and again, gave them nothing to lose. Why did it only matter when people were being odious towards Jewish students because of foreign policy? And there were horrific things, you know, Holocaust survivors getting firebombed by a crazy Egyptian, Jewish couple that got gunned down in an event at DC. Horrible stuff. Never should have happened. Categorically condemned. Awful. But why did you only care when that was happening, but not white men losing their jobs, being denied university placements, turning to drugs and drink in despair, killing themselves en masse, not having relationships, not having children, losing their faith, seeing their civilization go down the drain? Why didn't you care? And because you didn't care, they turned to someone like Nick Fuentes. They found their champion, and now you can't cancel them. So, if you find it so problematic, maybe start caring. Now, this is the strategy that didn't work, right? This is the Shapiro video. The reason Ben failed in his attack on Tucker and Nick, the reason Ben has lost 20,000 subscribers in a week, the reason presumably Daily Wire has lost some of its paying subscribers, is because at the start of the video, Ben opened with Nick's edgy, hyperbolic statement about women and black people. In it, Nick said some things that pretty much every frat boy has said when the camera's on, right? Nick said, women who are overly emotional maybe shouldn't go into politics because you don't have the sober rationality to make high-level political decisions. Oh, the horror. Has he said some other things about women that are kind of gross? Yeah. And Tucker actually, I think, in a polite way, pulled him up on it in the discussion they had, saying, well, what don't you understand about women? Why are you holding men and women to the same standard? Is that a source of frustration for you, that you feel like women are irrational and interrupt you? Why don't you think the ambiguous complementarity and the differences between men and women are a source of joy and you should want to make your wife happy? It's something that I took a long time to figure out because, admittedly, I had a few relationships with a few e-girls and it wasn't a good idea. Wouldn't recommend it. That's one of the sensible things Nick has said in his viral clips. No e-girls, ever. True. And it took me a while and a lot of reading, which I think I did publicly on Lotus Eaters, you know, talking to people that have written books on gender and sexuality, working through the manosphere stuff and figuring out what I disagreed with, going on dating apps, doing an experiment that ultimately led to me meeting my wife. I think all young men go through that period of confusion, frustration, development, and you have to fashion yourself into a rock upon which your wife's emotional waves may break, and you feel the authority in your household and be firm without being a tyrant, without dominating, without, as Nick said in the interview, shut up, woman. You know, you don't want that, frankly, third world coded dismissiveness that someone like Andrew Tate embodies. But he is correct when he says that if you aren't stoic, if you aren't in control of your emotions, you shouldn't be in politics. And he's also correct when he says that white people are, on average, avoiding black people now in America. It's a sad thing that happens. It's the Scott, you can probably help me with this, the cartoonist who tragically has cancer, did Dilbert, got cancelled recently, chat, throw it up. But Scott something got cancelled like 2 years ago. They attempted to cancel him because he just said, get away from black neighborhoods. This is in the aftermath of BLM, remember, when people could get, Scott Adams, that's it. People could get away completely with just gunning down people in the street and saying it was for racial justice. When people were looting and burning down stores, and the Vice President of the United States would then donate to their bail fund. And you know who agrees with that sentiment, even though he put a clip in his video cancelling Fuentes for it? Ben. Because Ben lives in a Jewish neighborhood in Florida. He doesn't live in a black neighborhood. He knows which neighborhoods are high crime, which are disrespected and run down, which are downwardly mobile, so he doesn't live in them. He understands there are cultural and ethnic differences between people. And yes, Nick pointed it out in a rude and hyperbolic way. And throwing out the N-word doesn't exactly help your public image. It might be funny among men that have grown up on the internet, but I think that we should have a bit more decorum than that. Maybe this is the Englishman in me. I think we should be polite and erudite. Express ourselves in a slightly better way. But you know what doesn't persuade those young men to abandon Nick? Complaining about him saying some truths in a rude fashion. And so, even before you get to the stuff where he talks about Jewish people, or the Holocaust, or is saying Hitler had aura, which, you know, Hitler and Stalin led to the largest number of deaths of white Europeans throughout history, so I don't think that's a very pro-European stance. I don't think they were the tragic unsung heroes of the Second World War. I think Stalin, Hitler, and Roosevelt were the villains, and Churchill, well, mixed character. Gallipoli, sacrificing the Suez and the Empire in order to fund the NHS. I mean, really? No thanks. But then, you know, his 1950s campaign slogan. Let's just say Churchill wouldn't have been in support of what's happened in Britain right now. Anyway, point being, even before he got to all that stuff that you might object to about, he didn't even put the Islam stuff in there, or his friendship with Destiny, didn't hit him from the right. Even before he got to the stuff that Ben obviously takes the most issue with, which is Jews, Israel, etc., because anti-Semitism was personal for Ben, he started off by henpecking Nick's inflammatory comments about women and black people. And I tell you what, every young man tuned out then. Nobody cared. Nobody cared. Because they are sick to death of being at the bottom of the intersectional pile and cancelled for saying things that are either plainly true or a bit offensive and hyperbolic that South Park or every MW2 lobby allowed them to joke in only a couple of years ago until HR sensitivities became the predominant culture. So, you can't cancel Nick from the left, and that's what Ben tried. And by doing so, he has rendered himself functionally irrelevant to an entire generation of young men, and confirmed their suspicions, whether unfounded or otherwise, that there are certain topics you can't talk about. The containment effort, that obviously was being tried here, failed. Utterly, utterly failed. So, this needs to be explained, because I put this in a tweet. I've been explaining it quite a lot, but this was tweeted out shortly before I came online by Brett Weinstein, again, Jewish man, who underwent the cancellation at, again, chat, remind me the college that him and his wife were at. Didn't she get cancelled because she said wearing offensive Halloween costumes is no big deal? Evergreen, that was it. So he said, the respectable folks are going to keep telling themselves that Nick Fuentes is just some vile little troll riding a monster wave of bigotry. I'm going to keep pointing out they're misunderstanding the wave and underestimating him. True, he's a talented broadcaster, even if he says things that are offensive. Ultimately, I'll have to explain Fuentes' appeal and skill set. Then I'll be condemned for 1, sympathizing with, 2, doing the bidding of, and 3, attempting to nuance around young adult Hitler. How about you all level up instead? Absolutely true. I said this on a clip that's coming out from Across the Pond, my new show with Tate Brown. on my channel, I said this on Twitter, you can't complain about losing the game if you don't feel the star player. Because even if you don't like what Nick says, and I've, again, taken issue with the things he said, can you name another under 30s white man speaking to other white men? Can you name another influential Zoomer? Can you name anyone who has defied cancellation by every institution from the time they were a teenager and has achieved the same level of success? I can't name a single one in the UK. I am orders of magnitude less than Nick, but I've probably got the largest audience. Aside from the Lotus Leaders Lads as a conglomerate, of course, for which I used to work. Nick did it all on his own. So, and there's no one else in America I can think of. And I know a bunch of the young guys who don't watch Nick, who work in politics, who share some of his views, but who have kept their heads down and didn't follow the same career path because they knew that voicing any of those views, not Hitler sympathy, not liking Stalin, not saying racial slurs, but just skepticism of American foreign policy and the adventurism that the Bush administration did, they knew they would get cancelled by every single major conservative think tank before their careers had even begun. They knew that if they questioned immigration, legal immigration, in the Republican Party, they would be strangled in the crib. And this is why it took someone completely cancelled from everything with nothing to lose to become the biggest influence on American politics, specifically youth politics, on the right, which now the Republican Party, a week out from an election, and all of their media apparatuses and think tanks are reacting to. You guys vacated the field. You lost the game. And you've now lost it for a very long time. So let me compare these two clips. I'll finish on this. Because it seems that Ben has actually recognized this in an interview in the last couple of days with, I can't remember her name, Dana something. It's on The First, and I've been on The First a couple of times with Jesse Kelly. Ben recognizes it, and much like Shapiro, he can accurately assess a situation, and then his prescriptions are just so off the mark. You know, Ben didn't back Trump in 2016. He backed DeSantis. He only backed Trump after, obviously, Kamala Harris and the Democrats became incredibly anti-Semitic and hated Israel. He backed the COVID vaccine. He was wrong about January 6th. Like, Ben has a track record of getting things wrong, of bad calls. And I say this with lamentation, because pretty much like all of you, I'd wager, if you're around the same age as me, right? You grew up enjoying SJW Destroyed compilations. You Can't Cuck the Tuck, right? Not just Carl and Milo, but Ben Shapiro. He was known for owning college students, for causing the 2016 Berkeley campus riots. Ben Shapiro had our admiration for a while. And then we found the limits of where he's willing to go. And the contradiction is whether or not America is just an idea, as he criticized J.D. Vance's speech at the RNC for saying America is a people in a homeland, versus, well, Israel is a nation, meaning people, meaning set place. And if you criticize those people in that place, you're an anti-Semite who should be cancelled. Now, I'm not trying to revise the Israeli settlement. I don't agree with, claims to indigeneity or land rights. I think pretty much every nation justifies itself by defending itself through force. So, but people notice the double standard. And so he's lost credibility. And here, he actually notices for a moment why Nick is so successful. Because of that double standard. And instead, he just says, well, nobody should engage in identity politics, meaning the Republican Party should continue to deny reality and fight with one hand behind its back and shouldn't take the side of heritage Americans. And that is why he lost his cancellation effort, and it's why he has lost a generation of young men who are unsubscribing in the thousands.
It's not just a passing thing. I mean, this is a growing thing, and there is a significant number of people in the Gen Z, demographic that they're talking about this. They're amplifying a lot of this. It's just bad information that a lot of people have, and they were infuriated. I just looked on social media. I'm sure you saw it. They were infuriated with Eric Trump's answer. And I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this, and we'll dive into it further.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that we can start with what's driving this in the first place. I think that one of the things that is driving this is the fact that for a decade or more, there was an attempt by the left to basically target Christian white men. And there's no question that this was true, that just in terms of policies were designed in order to disadvantage Christian white men, whether it was going after the Little Sisters of the Poor or the attempt to Me Too anybody who was, masculine in any way, the attempt to say that men could be women, the sort of DEI nature of all of American politics, the BLM movement, which is directed at the idea that there's a white supremacist superstructure. And in saying that over and over and over, what the left actually did is they started to create a feeling in a lot of young white men that as a targeted group, they actually were an identity group of their own. And then now as an identity group of their own, they must rise up and lay low anybody who is not a member of that group. And there are a lot of influencers and a lot of political commentators that we've talked about who are fomenting this because it goes viral online. The algorithms, particularly on X and on TikTok, are very, very fond of this, I think, for a wide variety of reasons, some decent and most not decent. I think there are a lot of manipulations in the algorithm there. But there are a lot of people who are perfectly willing to cater to this and then to sort of promote this idea. And that's how you get to this place. I mean, the fact that this was happening at a TP USA event and these sorts of questions are the kinds of questions that Charlie Kirk himself was routinely receiving over and over. And it was clearly coming, as Nick Fuentes said, it was clearly coming from Nick Fuentes' side of the aisle. I do not think this is originally a general outgrowth of normie traditional thought. A lot of the kinds of questions that you're hearing here. And the vice president was asked last week whether Judaism was targeting Christians, which is an absurd contention, just historically and contemporaneously. Those questions are coming from a particular place, and the humoring of that particular place is something that Charlie actually did not want to do. Charlie actually forbade the involvement of Nick Fuentes and the Groyper mentality and white supremacy from TPUSA. Obviously, that door has been breached, and I think that's why you're seeing that at TPUSA. And, frankly, I think that the TPUSA could do a better job of working with some of the personalities with whom it is currently working who are promoting this sort of stuff.
So, translation. People are coming to TPUSA events, young men who are watching Fuentes, look, I actually dispute that they're all watching Fuentes. I do. I think that this is just an organic feeling. Because I know lots of people who don't watch Fuentes, who share criticisms of Israel, who criticize the double standard put forward by liberal Jewish groups who push mass migration, but not for Israel. And they don't watch Fuentes. I don't watch Fuentes' show. And I can recognize some of these things as valid. Ben is saying, rather than engage with it, rather than address it, rather than have good arguments for it, yet again, censor the parameters of debate. Yet again, try and weed out people speaking at TPUSA events who are critical of this. He means Tucker, of course, because he's already said that Tucker shouldn't be on this platform. But also, presumably, limit the Q&A. And who was most famous for, who coined, if you disagree, you cut to the front of the line, which Charlie Kirk took up. Charlie Kirk was inspired by Ben Shapiro. He was inspired to take on people he disagreed with. He was inspired to take any challenging question. Charlie Kirk would sit there and talk to these guys about what was in the Talmud. And look, there's some insulting things that are in the Talmud. Whether or not they are the consensus of rabbis, Christians might be a bit upset about someone suggesting that Jesus is boiling in a vat of excrement for all eternity. There is probably some tensions between Jews and Christians that might need to be talked out, rather than just suppressed and censored, and then retreating from the principles that he spearheaded on college campuses that won him an audience of young men 10 years ago. So let's contrast this with a passage that went viral in a stream that Fuentes did after Tucker and Candace Owens sat down to talk about him. And again, I don't engage in this sphere of commentary because it's very American, right? I love America. I visit often. We've now got, the new show where we do bits of American and US politics. But this is niche American discourse. The only reason I'm talking about this is because it has implications for the UK, because I can see this is going to be copied in the UK. There will be a UK Nick Fuentes eventually, right? Just by the virtue of things like immigration not being on the table from these captured media outlets that are all part of the Marshall Network. If Ben acknowledges that white men recognize other groups in America play the identity politics game, Black Lives Matter for BLM, anti-Semitism councils for Jewish people, the Trevor Project and the Human Rights Organization for LGBT people, to the extent to where a transsexual can strip off on the White House lawn, but they are told, no, you have to be an individual, stick with Reaganism, only talk about economics, never talk about immigration and demographics, then you know what's going to happen? They're going to go towards the guy who is talking to them as disaffected white men. And this was the clip that went super viral when Nick was addressing the fact that Candace and Tucker were insulting him. And the only reason I'm playing this is because I want people to understand that listen to me as someone who has been able to be a peacemaker between various factions on the right? You know, I regularly speak to Konstantin Kisin. I also have appeared on Warren McIntyre's show and speak to him sometimes. You know, Douglas Murray has been very kind to me, and also I've got lots of friends and viewers who think that he didn't come out all the better in that Joe Rogan debate, you know? I think I've been able to be reasonable to these various people. If any of these people see this, if any of them listen, this is the reason above all else, not bots, not Qatari funding, not rising anti-Semitism through misinformation and algorithms, not a lack of reading John Locke, and a loss of memory of the virtues of liberalism. This sentiment, above all others, is why Nick Fuentes has a large and organic audience, and why, if someone speaks to white men as white men in other countries, they will have the same thing, and you won't be able to censor, cancel, and stop it.
Accused of being the CIA by Peter Thiel's best boys, by Tucker Carlson with his daddy. Tucker Carlson's, and you know what? Here's the other thing. Tucker Carlson said I'm a weird gay kid in the basement. Yeah, and I'm from Chicago. You're right. Well, okay, you're not right about all of that. But I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. Tucker Carlson says, I have so many trust funds, I never have to work. Tucker went to a $45,000 per year private high school, then a $45,000 per year selective Ivy League school in New England. Tucker Carlson's daddy was a Reagan appointee. And then, after years of bragging about being an elite, bragging about being so out of touch and so rich, now he's going to be the spokesperson for all the white people. Now he's going to roll up his sleeves. I just like to hunt and fish in my log cabin. I care about Klarna and credit card debt. But then when it comes to me, I'm one of the real disaffected white people. You want to talk about me and them? I am them. He says Nick Fuentes is leading all of the disaffected young white men. I am a disaffected young white man. I was a precocious, intelligent, young white college student who went to Boston University, who was pro-Trump and red-pilled by Trump and animated by Trump's message of America first. And I asked questions about Israel, and I was punished for it. I did it years before Tucker Carlson started talking about Israel last year. And I sacrificed, and I was targeted by the ADL, by the SPLC, by the federal government, by the conservative movement that both Candace and Tucker were a part of. Candace and Tucker had nothing to say about Israel until it became unavoidable last year. Not popular, but unavoidable. And now they want to gatekeep me out and do this personality attack and say I'm a bitter loser in my basement from Chicago. I'm a kid from Chicago. And they slipped up there because they forgot for 1 second that they're pretending to be the spokesperson for exactly that kind of person. Tucker's mask slipped, and he forgot for a minute that for 8 years he's been pretending to care about the plight of weird kids in their parents' basement who are broke and didn't go to an Ivy League school, living in cities that don't matter like Chicago, not like Washington, D.C. or LA or New York. And that's why he had such disdain and contempt for me in that moment. Between the personality attacks, he's lonely, he's weird, he lives in a basement. I'm sorry, did you guys forget that that's your target audience that you're trying to pander to? Did you forget that for 2 seconds? And I'm the inauthentic person? I am that person. I am a spokesman for the disaffected white man because I am one, and you two are not.
You don't have to agree with Nick on anything he says about Israel, some of the insulting things he says about Jews, his inconsistency on Islam, his use of racial slurs. You don't have to condone or agree with any of that to know that every syllable he said there is true. We crave authenticity. And if you are a young man who has grown up as a native on the internet, who is sick to death of treading round the landmines of unjust cancellation because someone else got offended, if you are sick to death of being held back by the laws and the culture and the censorship and the speech codes in your own country, if you think that you've been robbed of an inheritance, if you think that you don't have many avenues to achieve, if you don't have a father, unlike myself, who has been blessed with a loving family. But if you have been robbed of male authority figures in media, in your household, in your school, if you in your entire life you've been put down, if you've been insulted, if you have been told that you can't say this, and you can't make friends, you can't get ahead, because everything you do is toxic and patriarchal and oppressive, if you sought out on the internet some encouragement. You found you got some schadenfreude from watching Ben Shapiro destroy SJWs. You got some life advice from Jordan Peterson, 12 rules for life. You got involved in politics. You wanted to make a difference. You saw your country locked down and burned around you by communist radicals who hated you for the color of your skin, and you got blamed for it anyway. If you saw all of that, and then you went looking for someone to speak to you, to tell you, here are the opportunities you need to take. Here's how to put your life together. Here's what's wrong with the country. And in some instances, some people have scapegoated. Who's to blame? Is it any shock that someone who comes along offering all of that gains a massive following and sets the tone for politics? No. Whose fault is it that instead of speaking to that legion of disaffected young white men who were abandoned by every political party, every NGO, every media outlet, and every spokesperson for decades, whose fault is it that someone comes along and, says some edgy and contentious and, on occasion, reprehensible things, but that commands their loyalty? Whose fault is it? Is it his? Or is it yours? Don't complain about losing the game if you did not field a star player. And you know what? You didn't speak to any of those men for a very long time. And so someone who considers themselves among that group of men, who speaks to them, who is undeniably talented no matter your problems with how he puts that talent to use, is it any shock that he gets an audience? No. So there's 2 lessons here. The first, I'm ending on this. The first is that if someone speaks to disaffected young white men, someone gives them encouragement, someone talks about the things they want to talk about, but also, and this is something that I think Nick is lacking, at least in the clips and interviews I've seen, I don't watch his show full time, so I'm welcome to be corrected. If someone was to talk to them and say, you know what, I want you to have a wife, I want you to have kids, I want you to replenish your population, I want you to act as a custodian to your civilization, I want you to build tangible things, I want you to read old books, I want you to be better equipped than your enemies, I want you to involve yourself in politics, be a pillar of your community, to go back to church, to be the head of your household, I want you to be a mentorship figure to the other disaffected young men that will come in your wake that you never had. If someone speaks to them like that, then they will also command the loyalty of lots of young men too. And the other lesson to take from Fuentes is no matter how much you try and contain the conversation, no matter how much money you pump into having a monopoly on the means of communication, no matter how many political candidates you astroturf, no matter how many voices you try to cast into the wilderness and cancel from every social media platform, you banish from broadcast, you don't allow them to publish in your print outlets, you kick them out of every party, you deplatform them from every event, you bury the footage of their debate, You know what ends up happening? You give them nothing to lose, and they become a real big headache for you. And so if you don't want people in their desperation, their frustration, to turn into the likes of Nick Fuentes, maybe engage with them about the issues they care about, and maybe stop trying to contain, to gatekeep, to censor, and to control everything in politics. Maybe, in your hubris, you might just lose. Maybe recognize that it probably isn't going to work, as the means of communication have been democratized by social media. Maybe recognize you're leaving a lot of talent on the table that if you do not harness, if you do not, without trying to hobble it, bring it into the fold, then you are going to make enemies of those people, and you are going to render yourself irrelevant to them for a generation. Maybe it's something worth considering. Anyway, it's getting late. I can't believe how long I've gone on for. I see I've got a few super chats, so I'll answer those quickly before I go give my wife some attention. She's, without disclosing any personal details, she's actually not very well at the moment, so I would appreciate your prayers for her. And yeah, you know, we wanna everything to be healthy and whatnot when we hopefully try and start having a family of our own next year. It's not easy, by the way, because, you know, getting a house, getting married, it's wonderful having everyone show up to your wedding, but when you are on the outside of every institution, when you are being suspiciously blacklisted by everyone, when you are trying to build your own things and get funding for it, and your only source of income is what you earn by the skin of your teeth from YouTube and Substack and the like, it's difficult to be a household provider, and it's difficult to try and eventually, hopefully, have her on a single income at home raising my kids rather than having some state drone who hates me, everything I stand for, raise them instead. So, hey, look, I appreciate the prayers and the encouragement, guys. That's all I've got. Rare moment of vulnerability and honesty from me. But anyway, last few moments. Someone, Goth Bureaucrat, asks, I really appreciate your work. Where does your strength, confidence, and beliefs come from? I'm not serving myself. I am trying to fix the problems in my country so that I can look my kids in the eye when I eventually have them and say, I tried or I succeeded. And every Sunday, I ask without fail God to give me the courage and conviction to speak the truth, his word, in the world, regardless of the temptations or the expedient incentives that might waylay my commitment to what is righteous and what is true. I'm sure I fall short of it often. I'm sure that I get things wrong, or that but I try and do my best. And so there's no interceding reason that causes me to bite my tongue. The only rule I have, right, is that if I'm asked a question, I will answer it as honestly as I can, so long as I'm not divulging the private information of someone else that will put them in danger, right? So that keeps me honest and it keeps me true. From Melissa, very much agree, media monopolies are dangerous. Look, I'm not someone who thinks, power to the people, mass movement, we can't have an elite. Someone will always rule. There will always be power, there will always be hierarchy. My question is it prudent to have the people who are friendly with and agree with those who unrepentantly destroyed our country in control of every party, think tank, conference, and media apparatus in the country? Probably not. Probably not sensible. Last one from Bob Hunter. I went to the doctor complaining about pain in my soul. I filled my own prescription with love, peace, and kindness rather than antibiotics and fluff. Well, yeah, no medical advice from me, I'm afraid. I'm not qualified. However, I will say that every institution doesn't work in this country, and So, you know, small story. I have always had chronic migraines and appalling back pain. And my wife kept telling me to go to the doctor, get it checked out. And I ignored it. And we flew back from our honeymoon, and I just had a debilitating migraine and a real problem. So I went, okay, you know what? I'll get an appointment. Went in there. The appointment was half an hour late. I spent about 3 minutes in the doctor's. Didn't prescribe me any physical therapy. Didn't even check where the problem was. Just wrote me a prescription for painkillers. And then the painkillers also had an additional prescription for an anti-inflammatory, because it turns out the painkillers can cause severe inflammation and muscle ulcers and stomach ulcers. So he just gave me something to numb it, which could then cause additional problems to get me out of the office, because there's a massive backlog of appointments. And I'm paying for this. I'm forced to pay for it. So every interaction you have with a state institution just embitters you about the state of your own country. Doesn't have to be this way. Could be better. We could fix it if we were allowed to. If people weren't so invested on keeping the narrative on rails and the people that screwed it up in power. Someone said going to the gym fixes back pain. I don't want to mog everyone, so I've never posted the shirt, the selfie. Believe me, I do go to the gym. My wife is very happy with this. People, when I used to work at Lotus Eaters, Harry was always credited for being the sort of largest guy. You know, he's very tall, he's naturally in good shape. We always arm wrestled to a standstill. Same with myself and Charlie Downs, who does a lot of mixed martial arts. I am in decent shape, let's just put it that way. Though I saw someone comment the other day that I'm like the Zoomer trend of 20 going on 40. Yeah, it's because being on the internet for your entire life and looking at politics is basically the equivalent of an uphill paper round. Like, yeah, I've aged quickly. Look at my photos and footage from 2023 to now. I've aged like milk. I've got a white patch in my beard, and I'm 27. I'm gonna look like I've drank from the wrong cup at the end of Indiana Jones 3 by the time that we fix this country. But hey, you know, if my vanity has to be sacrificed on the funeral pyre, so be it. You know, my kids will thank me, I'm sure. Anyway, have I tried taking magnesium for migraines? Yes, I do. I supplement every evening. I appreciate the suggestion, but if you shook me, I rattle like a Tic Tac box. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. You are more than welcome to clip any of this, share it out, get the word out there. And again, please do take my advice. Like, go to these events, put things in YouTube comments, put things on Twitter, force the issue. Do it in a polite and well-informed way. Do it in a way which gives dignity to you and the things that you care about, but do it. Because if they're going to try and control the narrative and gatekeep us out of everywhere, be too big of a problem to ignore. Be the political equivalent of the migraines that I keep getting, that no painkillers will get rid of. It's only until you get to the root cause, which we'll find out one day, that you can actually get rid of them. And by going to the root cause, you have to admit it's there and address it. You can't just be like Fraser Nelson and just say, well, I hear your concerns, and then just gaslight you out of it. Anyway, I've got to go eat some potatoes and some steak, so thank you very much for watching. Yeah. Wasn't expecting to do like a 3 and a bit hour stream, so hope you enjoyed it. It won't be this long in future, but it was an issue that perturbed me. Till then, take care, God bless, and goodbye.